Hello curious people, today I am here to help you. I know you are using this video to help you fall asleep. So before you like this video and subscribe to the channel, tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Make yourself comfortable now. I stepped into the stories. Julia watched the stream of coffee fall into the officer's cup, wondering if what he had just said was nothing more than a bad joke. Unable to react, an odd coldness growing inside her, she crossed her arms to warm up, but all she felt were the patches of cold, dried blood on her shirt. The only sound breaking the silence in the police station was the coffee machine, lasting only a few brief seconds, indifferent now to the inquisitive gazes of the men standing beside her. Julia waited for Officer Fuentes to speak again, even though she knew she would have preferred to watch that thread of coffee fall forever. So, do you want to explain yourself? There was nothing to explain. She knew that no matter how hard she tried, nothing would sound reasonable to anyone else's ears except her own. Still, without wanting to, her mouth began to move, and a strangely fragile, unfamiliar voice started to speak. I met him by the river, on the outskirts. It was the Santos River, a winding line that divided the more than 2,000 kilometers of forest surrounding the eponymous town. She had never passed through that area, nor had she been interested in seeing a river she had only heard typical things about, before that warm Friday afternoon at the end of another school year. Despite being the target of insults and mistreatment from her classmates throughout the year, nothing had prepared her for what they had planned for her that day. They were going to make sure that people like her never set foot in the school again. A group of students, with the teacher's permission, had gotten the keys to the classroom and locked the doors before Julia could leave. What followed could only be remembered as a series of fleeting images and sensations that her mind had preferred to bury. Thousands of hands holding her down, markers piercing her skin, scissors cutting her clothes. By some miracle, she had managed to escape that hell and jumped through the window before her captors could catch her. She ran through several unfamiliar streets, pushing her way through a crowd of people shouting curses and attempting to land a few punches. Despite this, she reached the forest, and finding no other option, decided to take refuge there, both from the scolding she would receive from her father and from the gangs that came out at dusk. At one point, she had reached the Santo River, drawn by its murmur, and fell into a deep sleep. Later that night, she was awoken by the sound of a voice. When she opened her eyes, Julia saw the figure of a thin, ragged boy beside her. He tried to approach her, adjusting his square glasses, to which Julia threatened to throw a stone. She asked who he was and what he wanted. The boy, silent as a stone, did not respond. It wasn't until Julia let go of the stone that he spoke. If that tiny, brief voice could even be called speech. He told her his name was Boris, that he enjoyed spending time there by the river and visiting the abandoned cabin nearby, which he preferred over his parents' house. He asked Julia why she had come there and why she was in such a state. She, in tears, told him what had happened, how she hated being different from the others and being unable to do anything about it. She had promised herself she would leave the town and go to the city one of these days. Boris, meanwhile, just comforted her. Noticing the night sky, Julia realized that any possibility of returning home before her father's police shift ended was lost. She had heard that the gangs that came out at that hour targeted people like her and made them disappear. She didn't remember ever having met one, aside from her mother, and since she had died, she had lost hope of ever meeting one again. Despite this, Boris, who had heard the stories as well, offered to help her. After bringing a blanket and a bat from the cabin, he covered Julia, moved by the gesture, and together they left the forest and made their way back to town. Fortunately, that night, Julia managed to get home in time. In the following days, Julia took every opportunity she had to go to the river. For the first time in her life, she had made a friend, a real one. Since she could remember, the only person she had been able to talk to without fear of being judged was her father, though she still remembered the countless times in the market or park when he had made an effort to distance himself from her while interacting with others. With Boris, it was different. In those first days, they could talk about anything for hours and hours, though she always led the conversation, with their feet submerged in the cold river water, with nothing but the arrival of night interrupting them. By the river, she couldn't be hurt. She was safe from the gazes, words, and hands. Eventually, deep things, repressed emotions, became routine. At least for Julia. For Boris, it was easy to listen, but he never talked more than about his breakfast that day or his rock collection. Moreover, he seemed to not enjoy much physical contact. Every time Julia tried to get closer, he would pull away, and he didn't respond well to friendly punches or even greetings. Still, there was one thing they both agreed on. After the incident at school, Julia held on to her decision to leave the town, and together with Boris, she started saving money for what would be the most important day of her life. Every day, without fail, they would put a coin in a jar that Boris used to collect stones. At first, they were content with tips from their parents or coins they found under furniture, but it didn't take long for them to realize that they would need more than that to reach their goal. The first coin Julia stole from her father was from his desk, the change from some insignificant purchase. She felt that being the daughter of a police officer somehow gave her a certain freedom to do some things, and what began as a couple of coins quickly turned into bills. She never knew how Boris got his share, but at that moment, it only mattered that he did. One morning, Julia found Boris walking along the riverbank, muttering things to himself. With a strange excitement, he told her that he had an idea that would solve all their problems. He spoke of Libertad Street, on the other side of town, where there was the only gas station they had. The owners would leave their son in charge that night, a boy who was not all that bright. They would take advantage of the opportunity to empty the cash register and leave the next day. It didn't take much to convince Julia. And so, at dusk, they followed Boris's plan to the letter. They arrived at Libertad, both wearing caps to cover their faces, carrying a trash bag. The deplorable state of that part of town was evident. Julia noticed the piles of trash, the burnt poles, and the thousands of papers stuck to every inch of walls and doors, faded by time, with a few illegible words in red being the only thing distinguishable. Thick letters that spelled a curse to the image of something wicked, now practically invisible. Seeing all this only made them hurry, managed to get home in time. In the following days, Julia took every opportunity. She had to go to the river. For the first time in her life, she had made a friend, a real one. Since she could remember, the only person she had been able to talk to without fear of being judged was her father, though she still remembered the countless times in the market or park when he had made an effort to distance himself from her while interacting with others. With Boris, it was different. In those first days, they could talk about anything for hours and hours, though she always led the conversation, with their feet submerged in the cold river water, with nothing but the arrival of night interrupting them. By the river, she couldn't be hurt. She was safe from the gazes, words, and hands. Eventually, deep things, repressed emotions, became routine. At least for Julia. For Boris, it was easy to listen, but he never talked more than about his breakfast that day or his rock collection. Moreover, he seemed to not enjoy much physical contact. Every time Julia tried to get closer, he would pull away, and he didn't respond well to friendly punches or even greetings. Still, there was one thing they both agreed on. After the incident at school, Julia held on to her decision to leave the town, and together with Boris, she started saving money for what would be the most important day of her life. Every day, without fail, they would put a coin in a jar that Boris used to collect stones. At first, they were content with tips from their parents or coins they found under furniture, but it didn't take long for them to realize that they would need more than that to reach their goal. The first coin Julia stole from her father was from his desk, the change from some insignificant purchase. She felt that being the daughter of a police officer somehow gave her a certain freedom to do some things, and what began as a couple of coins quickly turned into bills. She never knew how Boris got his share, but at that moment, it only mattered that he did. One morning, Julia found Boris walking along the riverbank, muttering things to himself. With a strange excitement, he told her that he had an idea that would solve all their problems. He spoke of Libertad Street, on the other side of town, where there was the only gas station they had. The owners would leave their son in charge that night, a boy who was not all that bright. They would take advantage of the opportunity to empty the cash register and leave the next day. It didn't take much to convince Julia. And so, at dusk, they followed Boris's plan to the letter. They arrived at Libertad, both wearing caps to cover their faces, carrying a trash bag. The deplorable state of that part of town was evident. Julia noticed the piles of trash, the burnt poles, and the thousands of papers stuck to every inch of walls and doors, faded by time, with a few illegible words in red being the only thing distinguishable. Thick letters that spelled a curse to the image of something wicked, now practically invisible. Seeing all this only made them hurry, entered the gas station, distracted the poor boy in charge without much difficulty, and in less than 5 minutes, left the place with a bag of bills. Julia hid them under her bed at home, waiting for the right moment to use them. However, the right moment wouldn't come soon. When Julia was ready to leave, Boris wasn't. And when Boris was ready, Julia no longer was. A week passed like this, postponing her departure for the smallest reasons just to savor one more day of the comfort of routine. Meanwhile, the tickets continued to wrinkle under Julia's bed. One sunny morning, while cleaning one of her windows, Julia noticed a figure lurking behind a tree in her garden. She told Boris about it during one of their daily meetings. She could tell it worried him by the quick change in his expression and what he said. He told her he had suspected something was off with that gas station, but hadn't believed it was true. He had heard that one of the most dangerous gangs in town, the Blue Brothers, had been seen on Libertad Street. It was likely they'd already taken over the gas station and were looking for the culprits behind the robbery. Boris urged Julia to close all the curtains and leave for the city as soon as possible. Understanding the danger she was in, Julia knew her repeated delays had to end. She'd go home and pack her things once and for all. Before leaving, she told Boris she would see him the next day at the same place to coordinate their trip together. He gave a small smile and simply said yes. The first thing she did was close the curtains. She spent the whole night packing every piece of clothing, book, and ticket she had, hiding her only suitcase under the bed. When she finished, she intended to sleep, but then she heard someone knock at the front door. Cautiously, feeling a chill run through her body, she went to check. In the living room, her father slept in his armchair, with the TV on, showing a news program filled with shouting. Julia found a note at the bottom of the door. "We FOU." She couldn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, Boris reviewed the message, which only confirmed his suspicions. He asked Julia if she was ready to leave, if she knew the way, and how to survive outside. She said yes. She felt ready, but that feeling only terrified her. The rest of the day they avoided talking about the subject, instead laughing and discussing the city and what awaited them. Julia thought about the ice creams, all the flavors. She would never have to be kicked out of ice cream shops again or only taste the ice creams thrown at her, falling to the ground. Boris listened to her all afternoon without saying a word. He nodded, smiled, and rubbed his hands. As evening fell, Julia asked Boris to walk her home before saying goodbye, but he had to refuse. He needed to return home soon that time. Walking quickly through the streets of Santo, Julia couldn't remember feeling so vulnerable since the incident at school. The blurry papers on the walls and the burned debris from darker times never made her feel so sick. She managed to read one of the papers. The word "foxy" had never been so clear. Another one wasn't so different. Lycée. Then another one. Shit. Kill. Dead. She turned onto the street that led to her house and spotted a familiar figure in the distance. When she realized who it was, her body froze. Behind that figure, 3 others came into view, and together, they began running towards her. Julia turned around and saw 3 more figures approaching. Surrounded by the group, Julia braced for the worst. The first person she saw was the first to approach. He was a young, thin guy, wearing a leather jacket and a blue bandana tied around his left arm. In a quick movement, he grabbed her by the hair with one hand, and they all started laughing. After shouting some horrible words Julia preferred not to remember, he threw her to the ground and began kicking her repeatedly all over her body, amidst a wave of insults and mockery. On the ground, trembling from the pain, she looked up, and a flash of light blinded her before she lost consciousness. She spent 3 days in bed recovering from her injuries. Her father had found her bleeding on the ground in the rain. It caused him great pain to see her in that state, but he chose to keep the incident a secret. He brought her food to bed and checked on her constantly, and Julia, feeling the suitcase on her back, couldn't look him in the eye or speak to him. On the 4th day, a Friday morning, Julia took her suitcase and left the house without waking her father. She planned to spend the whole day by the river, waiting for Boris to arrive. She heard him approach after a few hours. Seeing her injuries, Boris, perplexed, came over to check on her, but didn't touch her. He bombarded her with questions that Julia didn't bother answering. She just assured him that she was fine, that it had been an accident. She hadn't come just to inspire sympathy. She showed him the suitcase and the tickets inside. It was time to leave. She had nothing else to do there, and he clearly wasn't busy with how early he'd arrived. They wouldn't have a better opportunity than that. Julia asked him where his bags were. It didn't matter. She'd wait there until he brought them. Despite her excitement, Julia gradually noticed that Boris, as silent as ever, didn't share her enthusiasm. Defeated, she asked him one last question. "You will come, right?" The silence that followed only confirmed what she feared. With tears in her eyes, she repeated the question over and over, trying to grab Boris's shirt, but he pushed her hands away. At one point, Julia grabbed his shirt so forcefully that he gave up, and she, as close to him as she had ever been, kissed him on the lips. Boris jerked away from her, and with eyes filled with rage, spat on the grass before running toward the trees. It wasn't unusual to find the streets near the main road empty at the time Julia arrived, but that day they looked like something out of a ghost town. Walking leisurely, replaying the conversation in the woods in her head, she realized she had reached the intersection of the main street with Libertad Street, the gas station illuminating the horizon like a giant lamp. Guided by a morbid curiosity, she turned onto that street, thinking she would reach the road through the gas station. Under its lights, she glanced at the elderly receptionist couple in the shop and walked toward the road. However, the silhouette of a man sitting by the shop's door stopped her. He was just a drunk, finishing the last drops of his bottle. But when his arm entered the light, and she noticed him. On the 4th day, a Friday morning, Julia took her suitcase and left the house without waking her father. She planned to spend the whole day by the river, waiting for Boris to arrive. She heard him approach after a few hours. Seeing her injuries, Boris, perplexed, came over to check on her but didn't touch her. He bombarded her with questions that Julia didn't bother answering. She just assured him that she was fine, that it had been an accident. She hadn't come just to inspire sympathy. She showed him the suitcase and the tickets inside. It was time to leave. She had nothing else to do there, and he clearly wasn't busy with how early he'd arrived. They wouldn't have a better opportunity than that. Julia asked him where his bags were. It didn't matter. She'd wait there until he brought them. Despite her excitement, Julia gradually noticed that Boris, as silent as ever, didn't share her enthusiasm. Defeated, she asked him one last question. "You will come, right?" The silence that followed only confirmed what she feared. With tears in her eyes, she repeated the question over and over, trying to grab Boris's shirt, but he pushed her hands away. At one point, Julia grabbed his shirt so forcefully that he gave up, and she, as close to him as she had ever been, kissed him on the lips. Boris jerked away from her, and with eyes filled with rage, spat on the grass before running toward the trees. It wasn't unusual to find the streets near the main road empty at the time Julia arrived, but that day they looked like something out of a ghost town. Walking leisurely, replaying the conversation in the woods in her head, she realized she had reached the intersection of the main street with Libertad Street, the gas station illuminating the horizon like a giant lamp. Guided by a morbid curiosity, she turned onto that street, thinking she would reach the road through the gas station. Under its lights, she glanced at the elderly receptionist couple in the shop and walked toward the road. However, the silhouette of a man sitting by the shop's door stopped her. He was just a drunk, finishing the last drops of his bottle. But when his arm entered the light, and she noticed, "She's your daughter, right?" "Unfortunately, yes, sir." On the road, Julia thought about everything Boris was missing. Things hadn't gone according to plan, but at least she was on her way to the city. She would see the buildings as tall as the sky, the cars floating down the streets, and most importantly, the ice cream shops. She couldn't stop imagining the flavors, endless, but equally delicious. She only worried they wouldn't let her visit the ice cream shops. She had to find a way to get there. Would there be ice cream at the courthouse? Peering through the grills that separated her from the driver, Julia got her first glimpse of the city. It was unlike anything she had imagined before. The buildings were taller, and the cars faster. The police truck entered a highway that seemed to have no end, where thousands of cars and people moved in perfect harmony. Julia observed, from inside this metropolis, the concrete and metal miracle in all its splendor, but something in particular caught her attention. Attached to the buildings, hanging from the bridges, and even projected into the air, thousands of billboards decorated the landscape. And on each one, different faces, yet, in a way, the same one, appeared, accompanied by symbols and words Julia couldn't read, or simply didn't bother to anymore. Bold words in a deep red, words that only inspired death. "It's me. It's me. It's me. I'm never taking the 5:10 a.m. bus again." The foam earplugs I put in last night before closing my eyes did nothing for the reverberations rumbling through my wooden-framed bed. Phew luck. I groaned as I rolled over to let the piercing neon numbers of the alarm clock sting my swollen eyes. 3:52 a.m. The bass beat from the apartment above was increasing in speed and tone, then suddenly stopped. I made out the muffled voice as the verse climaxed through the ceiling. "Smack my bitch up." The booming resumed. People still listened to Prodigy. It was a mundane thought before my inevitable daily rage set in. After weeks of disrupted sleep, I was beginning to lose my cool. I had tried confronting my clamorous neighbors on multiple occasions. First, in the lobby, by attempting to catch one of them on their way up only to be thwarted by a speedy elevator door. My building requires a key to get to each floor, so knocking on their door was not an option. Calls to the building manager were met with recommendations to call the authorities, but I knew what he really meant was, "Leave me alone." I even resorted to ramming a broom handle against the ceiling with the hopes that they'd get the hint. On that night, the electric punk night owls responded with synchronized stomping and laughing before cranking Jesus built my hot rod even louder. Assholes. Another glance revealed 3:59 a.m. A deep breath, then I tossed the warm layer off. The alarm wasn't due to sound for another hour. Fuck my life. I collected myself and found minimal solace in the idea of getting to work early enough to come home for a nap before DJ Tragedy and his sound man woke up for the day. I work in the city as a warehouse manager and set my own hours, so leaving early wasn't a problem. As long as the shit's done. As my boss so eloquently puts it. The air was brisk as the waxing moon settled onto the horizon. There were no signs of its warmer counterpart arriving anytime soon. I've boarded the 5:10 a.m. bus a number of times in the past for the same reason as today. It lacked the familiar, exhausted, and soulless faces I normally recognize during our shared trip, each morning only replacing them with the unfamiliar. I always smiled at people in passing when I was growing up, but was robbed of that desire only a few weeks after my move. Long ago, I confidently concluded that this city devours its inhabitants' joy with absent effect. The 5:10 a.m. bus was no different in that regard. The driver was a salt and pepper-haired black man in his 50s, kept warm by a poofy navy blue jacket zipped halfway. The closed portion failed to disguise his round gut beneath. Rapid Transit was embossed on the left breast in yellow and orange. He offered no greeting, only focusing on the machine between us to ensure I had the funds to ride. After swiping my card and an affirmative nod from him, I proceeded down the narrow aisle, stepping over the occasional outstretched leg or bag. I prefer to ride towards the back. Positioning potential nutjobs to the front was always safer than wondering what they were doing behind you. The first 6 rows were sporadically filled with a few men in suits with briefcases resting on their laps or on the seat to their side. Their tight grasps and darting eyes deceived their attempted projections of calm. The regulars weren't convinced either, but showed no signs of interest. The city bus isn't for everyone. Midway were a number of what I assumed were construction workers by their scuffed tan boots, unshaven faces, and bagged lunches. An occasional hard hat confirmed my suspicions. Various 20-somethings still drunk and slash or high were working their way home from the overabundance of clubs and bars that populated my neighborhood. The bus faintly smelled of stale sweat and alcohol. I always appreciated how most drivers would keep the air circulating on high rather than adjusting the temperature and turning it down. It helped. A little. The lights were turned off as I took the same seat I normally do on my regular bus and nestled against the cold glass. The city lights began their rhythmic dance as we pulled forward. My bus. I laughed to myself, as if there was a difference. A neon-haired couple suckling pacifiers began jostling in their seats to what I assumed was an ill attempt at dancing 3 rows in front. Thank God they weren't blasting music from their phones, as could typically be expected. My initial scan of my peers while moving through the aisle assured me it should be an uneventful ride. The gentle sway afforded by the vehicle's airbag suspension began to lull me back to my creaky IKEA mattress. The sound violently escalated from a low, throaty tone to piercing shrill. U-ha-a-a-a-a-a-a-a-a-a-a-c-k. Snap. T-S-D-T-S-S-S-S-S. I quickly sat up to see the woman had gained the attention of the rest of the bus, if only momentarily. For fuck's sake, mumbled one of the construction workers loudly enough for me to hear 4 rows back. Goddamn it, said another in a longtime smoker's raspy voice. Crazies on the bus were nothing new. Few maintained eyes on the woman for more than a second before going back to their own thoughts or phone screens. I hadn't noticed her earlier. A-C-K, K-U-H, K-U-H, A-A-A-A-A-A-A-C-K, crack, T-S-S-S-S, spouted the woman as she stood. Her guttural sounds somehow placed emphasis on her mechanical movements. Her limbs and head seemed to snap to each desired position. There was a hollow, wet, clicking sound coming from her throat when she didn't use her voice. The overhead speakers crackled and chopped as the driver fumbled the microphone. If anyone was still asleep, they were surely forced into our mobile circus now. "Ma'am, sit down and stop shouting, or you're off at the next stop," demanded the driver. "Now, reader, here's where I need you to pay attention. I assure you I was not drunk, and I don't do drugs. I know I told you that I didn't get much sleep, but I remember this next bit crystal clear, and I have no explanation. I honestly don't know how I'll ever sleep again." Ignoring the driver's ultimatum, A-H-H-A-A-C-K, pop, K-R-A-T-T-T-T, shrilled the tall, thin frame now standing in the aisle facing rear. Her green summer dress hung loosely from her shoulders, revealing rail-thin arms and calves. It reminded me how it must look on a hanger in the closet. When the driver turned the overhead fluorescence on once again, I noticed that she wasn't wearing any shoes either. "Ma'am," exclaimed the now audibly angered conductor, "I said sight de go on." I leaned forward in my chair, no longer relaxed against the window. With the newly added light, I could clearly see her eyes between the long, lifeless strands of black hair that parted her partially obscured face. They were black, completely black, and those obsidian orbs locked onto mine through narrow slits. I wouldn't consider myself a coward, and never fearful of your typical disruptive rider, but I felt ice force through my veins at that moment. I couldn't look away. Her dark hair and eyes were an unsettling contrast to the pale skin below them. Her nose was thin, and as her hair swayed, the ice I felt inside somehow got colder. There was only smooth skin from her philtrum to bony chin. She had no lips. What in the fuck? Some sort of new trendy body modification. I didn't anticipate feeling my back press against the seat. My tense legs began to cramp from the force pushing me back. Oak, time for you to get off, I thought to myself. The next stop was a block ahead. The loudspeakers came alive again. Go digam it. Sit thee fo kiki down. Only this time the anger coming out of them was muffled. My head felt dull, as if I had cupped my hands over my ears. From my peripheral view, I could make out the other riders beginning to adjust themselves to the commotion, but I could not move my eyes from hers. I realized I could no longer make out the hum of the bus's engine located beyond the firewall 2 rows behind. The passengers' mouths moved, and the sounds of gathered belongings should have made their way to my ears, but they did not. There were no sounds other than the choking, clacking menace somehow coming out of her. The awkward snaps and jerks from before became more deliberate as she moved toward me, mocking my earlier thoughts of safety in the rear. But she was moving toward me. She's got to be 80 ulbs soaking wet. I thought to myself, get a grip. I gathered all the muster I could manage, determined to snap out of whatever this was. Did I fall asleep? CK, snap, TT, TL pop, TEEELLTHEEEEEM. I heard her words, but she gave no clue of their origin. Her jaw never moved, but I could see her throat working. Crack, EH, AH, EEEEYE, IKNEEDU pop, CK, whoa, who. Tell them. Tell who? You know me. My mouth failed me. In panic, I aimed to stand and confront. No, I planned to run at this point. No need to be a hero here. Psycho no mouth bitch. But I didn't. I couldn't. I discovered limp arms to my sides, and any effort to move my eager legs was met with unwilling stubbornness. I was frozen and could not move. As she moved closer, I became aware of the rest of the bus moving farther from me. It's like it was somehow stretching, placing an ever-widening gap between the world and my place at the back of the bus. The other passengers were out of focus and impossibly far away now. Her ratcheting steps drew her closer. Only 2 rows separated us. The noises became louder. Odd and strange gave way to trepidation and dread. EH, AH, EEEEYE. I crack, CK, I bobo ONDER TS, TSSS, woo ONDER, snap, if you woo ogu CK, you. Wonder if I what? Jesus Christ, lady. What the fuck is this? Fuck. Closer. I could make out her bare foot below the chair in front of me. 1 row was all that was separating us now. A frail hand of 8 digits slid onto the preceding headrest above as 2 thumbs dug in from the side. Black and gray nails pierced the fabric. A wave of rot and perfume forced into my nostrils. Pop. I.
FFFFFF YOOUUUUCK CS TSSSS Snap YLLBTS CK Wonder if I'll be different? Her left foot stepped onto the seat to my right, nearly on top of my useless upturned hand, as her pointed knee pressed into the green fabric. The stench was forced into my mouth and stomach. Fuck. 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 She pressed another sharp joint into the cushion to my left, straddling my lap. Her skin was grayer than I noticed before. Terror took hold as I counted all 20 digits, slowly reaching to cut my face. Hard nails pressed into my scalp. I'm not sure I could have moved now if I wanted. And I wanted. Her face drew closer to mine as I felt my head lift from the cushion, driven forward by those 20 piercing points.
Our eyes, now only inches apart, revealed my assailants to be liquid. I can only describe them as flowing blackness that seemed to roll and slosh inside deep sockets. The pain from her nails in the back of my skull was intense enough to blur my vision. Do not pass out. You can't pass out. I felt her clammy forehead press against mine, then her nose. She did not stop. The agonizing force of her face pressing against my own was unrelenting. It eclipsed the new growing pressure on my chest. She was pressing her entire body into mine. Her smooth mouth pressed my lips, our noses now deformed into each other's cheekbones. The last I remember was feeling as if our eyes had actually touched, that she had moved into me. Liquid darkness was all I saw. It felt lonely and cold, a vast nothingness, a short symphony of squeals, and the hissing release of hydraulic brakes did not obscure the driver's announcement, Cambridge and Townsend. I sat up to find myself in the same seat I remembered. Two of the men in suits were already walking to the front, and half the construction workers had been replaced with new hairstyles from my perspective. My hands raced to my head, expecting to find torn flesh and hair and blood, but discovered no wounds. I stared at my trembling open palms in disbelief. Cambridge and Townsend, squawked the overhead voice once more. Still shaken, I nearly ran for the door, fearing entrapment if I stayed another second. I glanced at the driver, anticipating some sort of acknowledgement of the nightmare we all just experienced. He frowned. "Seem on, man. I'm already 5 minutes behind. On or off? Let's go." As I stepped onto the sidewalk, the blast of cold morning air and sounds of the bustling city reassured me it was over. I don't remember much of the rest of my walk to the warehouse other than it was uneventful. Passers-by all equally oblivious to each other as they scurried about their morning business. How can everyone be so calm? What the hell just happened? I flashed my badge to the guard at the gate, who nodded back. Then, a familiar voice from behind. "Early again, huh? You know, I know a guy who can fix your neighbor problem." Greg was my boss. Kind of rough around the edges, but personable enough. His colorful language helped pass the monotonous days of counting boxes. I turned toward him as he flashed his badge, then quickened his steps so that we could walk together. "Huh? Oh, yeah," I mumbled. Assholes were at it again. I must have spoken softly. "You good dude?" I could hear rare concern in his voice, studying the cracked painted lines on the ground as we walked across the parking area. I responded, "Yeah, it's just, fuck man. I don't know what to say. I think I dozed off on the bus and had some night terror or some shit. I dunno. It's kind of fucking with me." He craned his neck, jokingly analyzing my pants. "Well, you didn't piss yourself, Sue." His big palm nearly knocked the wind out of me as he slapped my chest. "Unless you need to go clean shit out of your drawers, we got 3 trucks in the back, and Go's called in sick." He abruptly stopped. "Jesus, dude," he exclaimed. What? What the fuck is wrong with your eyes?" The 20 points of pain began to throb along my scalp. "I wonder if Greg will be different," the voice in my head cackled. I felt my lips being pulled together. Is anyone else immune to the broadcast, like me? I've come to really hate this time of year. Maybe my grief over Alex would be more dormant if I had even a speck of closure or understanding about what transpired in October 2015. But I simply don't. I loved him, and coping with his absence would be hard enough if it was as straightforward as a failed marriage, a terminal illness, or a tragic accident. Even if he had been murdered, as horrific as that would have been, murder would have at least had some associated motive and finality to it. At least I'd be certain he was dead. As I write this, I desperately hope that he is dead. Honestly though, I believe he's still alive somewhere. When the reality of that concept takes hold, it fills me with an intense, unyielding dread. And everyone around me, my coworkers, neighbors, and even my family don't remember what actually happened and their part in it. I would give anything to be like them, to have the hollow comfort of false memories. But for some God-forsaken reason, I am somehow immune to the broadcast. I'm posting this because I hope to find at least one other person who has to live with the truth like me. It started on the first Saturday of October. Night had covered the Chicago suburbs, and we relaxed on the couch with some cheap whiskey and cable television. I honestly can't remember what we watched, but I have an oddly vivid memory of the moments before the broadcast. I had set my glass down on the table to look over at Alex, and I found myself in the blissful stasis that comes with truly loving someone. We knew each other from childhood. Alex proved a kind soul, a hard worker, and a best friend. He had a sturdy head on his shoulders as well. His logical and even-tempered nature provided a great counterbalance to my skittishness. My emotional stargazing ended abruptly due to the blaring emergency broadcast that started coming from our television. Looking back at our TV screen, I was immediately perplexed by what I saw. The siren continued its sound, but it lacked the usual emergency display with its colored bars. Instead, the noise was playing over what appeared to be the set of a live studio audience type sitcom. The feed appeared hazy, indistinct, and dusty as if recorded in the 70s or 80s. Two staircases, one on each side of the frame, climbed a few steps before turning to meet at a central balcony, occupying the top third of the room. Below the balcony was a family living space, with a stiff-appearing burgundy couch and loveseat in the center. A Persian rug, bright blue and gold, lay under the sofa. The color mismatch of burgundy, blue, and gold was immediately off-putting. In fact, the entire set was slightly off. Multiple framed family photos hung on the walls, yet the pictures were positioned too low, almost knee-level instead of eye-level. Seeing the fine details proved challenging because of the poor connection, but every photograph seemed to feature a different family, each striking the same pose, arms around each other and looking forward set against a cloudy blue backdrop, like something out of a Sears catalog. A lamp without a lampshade sat on the table next to the couch. Its bulb was oversized and bigger than the actual chassis of the lamp. An entire taxidermy deer occupied a space in the back of the room behind the couch, head facing toward the wall instead of forward and into the room. Uncanny is the word for it all, I guess. Before I was able to question Alex about what he thought was happening, a solitary figure appeared on screen from stage left. We first saw a black pant leg with a matching black tuxedo shoe enter the frame, but it did not immediately make contact with the wooden tiling of the set. Instead, right before hitting the floor, it stopped its motion and remained suspended off the floor for at least 30 seconds, as if the whole thing had transitioned to being a still photograph instead of a video. Abruptly, the heel of the shoe finally made contact with the ground, causing the emergency siren to stop instantly. Nothing replaced the deafening noise, not even the familiar sound of dress shoes tapping against a hard surface. The figure rapidly paced to the area in front of the couch and turned to face the camera. In addition to his shoes not sounding against the wood tile, at times, his feet seemed to slightly phase in and out of the floor. He wore a deep navy peacoat buttoned up to the top button, with half of a white bow tie peeking out from the collar. In his hand, he held the same type of microphone used by Bob Barker during his tenure on The Price is Right. I think it's called a gooseneck. It was long and slender, with a tiny microphone head on top to speak into. A power cord connected to the microphone dragged behind him, eventually tapering off to reveal that the damn thing wasn't even plugged in. I don't recall too many details about his face. Intentionally, it has helped me cope, but I can't forget his eyes and eye sockets. They were cavernous, triple the diameter and depth of an average person. The sockets extended well into his forehead, almost meeting his hairline, down into his cheekbones, with the perimeters connecting at the bridge of his nose. His actual eyes looked almost normal, proportioned correctly, and moving as you'd expect. That being said, they appeared to be made of glass, the stage lights intermittently refracting off one or both, depending on his positioning. After some excruciating silence, he introduced himself as Mr. Eugene Tantamount and began to spin his brief monologue. I will attempt to transcribe the speech as I remember it below, but I can't say it is 100% accurate for two reasons. One, those few minutes of my life happened upwards of 10 years ago. On top of that, the speech was incoherent and nearly unintelligible, to me at least. Mr. Tantamount spoke with a very awkward and clunky phrasing and took seemingly random pauses, all while interspersing a variety of nonsense words into the mix. Here's the best summary I can come up with from what I remember. In terms of the nonsense words, I am mostly guessing in the spelling. I would hear them a lot in the days following the broadcast, but never saw them written down. Hello, guests. My, what day we're having. It reminds me of before. Pauses for about 15 seconds or so. As another note, I do not recall him even speaking into the microphone. He just kind of held it off to his side. But on to matters. What of the next steps? Who will have the win to become Clevensting? Ah yes, the Grand Great. As much as everyone wants to become Clevensting, not all can. And I am part of all. As you can plainly see, I am very trivid. Pauses, points his right index finger at one cavernous eye socket, after which he points at the other, looking around as he does so. However, one of the population is not trivid, or they have the courage to expel trividness. To become Clavensting, the hero must become a fulfilled. They must show utmost gristive. A hero rejects trivid and becomes gristive, which you can plainly look that I am not. Pauses again, identically points his right index finger at eye sockets like he did before. Alas, only time will speak. But soon, as our now time, Clavensting grows withered. Show your gristive and become above. To honor dying hero, say today is now over to the past, and begin all future. Bows, screen goes black. Initially, I experienced shell shock. I looked over at Alex to try to begin unpacking what the actual fuck just happened when another image flashed on screen, accompanied by what sounded like an amphitheater full of people clapping, somehow louder than the emergency siren. An elderly man in his 60s or 70s was pictured sitting on a throne made of slick, black material. Nothing else was easily visible in the frame. The background was obscured by the angle of the camera and the darkness that lurked behind him. The fuzzy quality that made the last segment feel like a sitcom had dissipated. He wore green and brown army camo, with the sleeves and his pant legs rolled up to their halfway point to reveal his forearms and calves. Initially, it looked like his arms and legs were gently resting against the material. However, upon further inspection, it became clear that all the skin that made contact with the chair was fused with the throne itself. It's hard to explain, but imagine how the cheese on a burger patty looks when it is cooking. Specifically, when the edges of it extend beyond the meat and onto the grill itself. How the cheese ends up bubbling and cauterized against the hot metal. That's how the skin that contacted the throne looked. Above his collar, his eyes remained open, held by the same black material, which fish-hooked under his upper lids and tethered them to something out of the frame, keeping his eyes open and unblinking. The material appeared to fill the space around his eyeballs, slowly leaking down the corners of his eyes. He only looked forward into the camera. I am unsure if he could move his eyes elsewhere. His mouth stayed closed. However, the material trickled down the edges of his lips, just as it did from the sides of his eyes. I thought he was dead, until I saw the synchrony of his chest, rising with the subsequent flaring of his nostrils. It was slow, but he looked like he was breathing. Before I was able to discern more, the feed unceremoniously returned to normal. I turned to Alex and reflexively asked, "Jesus, what was that?" Guerrilla marketing for a new movie was the only explanation I could think of at the time. Alex held his hands over his mouth, sitting forward, letting his elbows rest on his knees. I assumed that the broadcast had really startled him, and I put my hand on his shoulder, trying to console him. Then he said something like this. "Can you imagine?" "Can I imagine what, love?" I replied. "Can you imagine getting the chance to be Clavinsting?" He said, eyes welling up with tears. A little taken aback, I figured he cracked a joke to deal with whatever avant-garde bullshit we'd unwillingly endured. I forced a chuckle, trying to play along with the bit, but he turned and glared at me with instantaneous rage. Jarred by the suddenness of his anger, I found myself too bewildered to calibrate a different response, and he silently excused himself to the bedroom and went to sleep for the night. I followed him in a few minutes after that, taking a moment to compose myself, but he did not want to talk about it anymore when I met him in bed. As far as I can recall, the following few days remained relatively normal. Slowly, however, Alex began to exhibit strange behavior. First, I found him rummaging through my sewing supplies, observing the geometry of my sewing needles from every angle, holding them by the head while swiveling his head around them. When I asked him what he was doing, he said something along the lines of, "Could I borrow some of these?" I asked why the hell he would need to borrow some of my sewing needles. He again got frustrated with me, dropped everything, and left the room. One night, I woke up to find him out of bed at 3 a.m. or so. Concerned, I got up to look around. He wasn't in our bathroom, the kitchen, or the living room. Eventually, I started calling out for him. I was about to call 911 when I located him in our guest bathroom with the light off, which nearly gave me a heart attack. Alex was stretching both of his lower eyelids and staring into the mirror. I gave him shit for not responding to me while I was calling his name. When my anger softened to concern, I asked him to explain his actions. I think he responded, "Just checking how trivid I am." The following morning, he did not go to work. When I asked him if he felt unwell and took a sick day, he told me he quit his job. He let this abrupt and significant life decision slide out of him while sitting at the kitchen table, sequentially lifting each of his fingernails of one hand with the other and inspecting the space under them by putting them right up to his face. I stood there in stunned silence, and eventually he said to me, or maybe just to himself, "I'm really pretty gristef, I think." Alex clearly suffered a mental breakdown following what we had seen on TV a few nights before. I sat down next to him and put my right hand over his, noticing a firm, thin, and movable lump between the tendons of his second and third fingers. When I saw the pin-sized entry wound closer to his wrist, I realized he had inserted one of my sewing needles under the skin of his hand. He saw my abject horror, and his response was, "Slightly less trivid now. More work to be done, though." I phoned my mother, explaining the whole situation in a likely confusing jumble of words and gasps. When I was done, my mom paused for a few moments and then replied, "Well, honey, I wouldn't be too worried. I think he is going to be able to get more gristef. What an honor it would be for both you and Alex, if he were selected to be Clavinsting, I mean. Let him know he can come over and borrow more sewing needles if he thinks he needs to." Speech failed me. At some point, my mother hung up. I guess she supposed we got disconnected when, in reality, I was just catatonic. Everyone I talked to in the days following the broadcast spoke exactly the same as Alex and my mother. They all knew the lingo and, moreover, acted like I knew what the fuck they were talking about. We started getting cold calls to our home phone from numbers I did not recognize. They would ask if they could speak to Alex, or they'd ask how it was going, how trivid he still was, and how gristef I thought he could be. Eventually, these numbers were from area codes from states outside Illinois. Then, it was international calls. If Alex got to the phone before me, he would just sit and listen to whoever was on the other end of the line with a big grin on his face. At a certain point, I disconnected our home line, but that just meant all these calls started to come to our cell phones. If I asked, he was unable to or unwilling to explain the meaning of any of this. In fact, he looked dumbfounded when I asked. Like the questions were so frustratingly basic that he could not even dignify them with a response. All the while the memories of Mr. Eugene Tantamount, the man in camo, and the black plastic substance haunted me. No research I did on any of it was ever fruitful. And to me, that meant Alex was going insane. And no matter how much I begged and pleaded, Alex refused to see a physician. At work, people would pat me on the back or go out of their way to do something nice for me. Initially, I assumed they had somehow heard that Alex's grasp on reality was weakening and they were trying to offer me support. This notion shattered when my boss presented me with a Hallmark card, signed by every member of my office, all 40 or so of them. Inside, it said, "Thank you for supporting Alex and congratulations on being the spouse to the next grand great. Alex will make a wondrous clavinsting. Sometimes, I wish I had just given up, gone far away, and with no plan of returning, all with the recognition that this event was beyond my understanding or control. If I had done that, I would have had a different last memory of Alex. But I loved him, and I couldn't abandon him. And now I am cursed with the memories of those final few minutes." When I returned home from work 3 weeks after this all had started, I discovered Alex sitting at our grand piano in the living room. Music was his creative outlet for as long as I had known him, and I felt a brief pitter-patter of hope rise in my chest seeing him sitting on the piano bench, back turned towards me. That hope vanished with the noise of a wire being cut with scissors. I slowly paced towards him, trying to brace myself for whatever was happening. When I got to Alex's shoulder and saw that he was delicately feeding piano wire through the space between his left eyelid and eyeball towards the back of his eye socket, I felt my knees give out, and I fell backward. The noise drew his attention towards me, and he pivoted his body and smiled proudly in my direction, small spurts of blood running down his face onto his t-shirt. His right eyeball bulged from its socket, with a few centimeters of piano wire sprouting out from the cavity at the 6 o'clock position. I think I'm finally Gristiff ***. I rushed to call the paramedics, locking myself in our bedroom for the time being. They assured me that they understood and would be there ASAP. Sobbing, I prayed that the ambulance would be here soon, before Alex lost his vision, or worse. It couldn't have been more than a minute before I heard multiple knocks at the door. The knocks continued and intensified as I ran past Alex to what I thought were the medics. No words being spoken by whoever was on the other side. As I opened the door, 20 or so people spilled inside our home. Some of them I recognized. Next-door neighbors, a UPS man I was friendly with, but most of them were strangers. They were all smiling and clapping and laughing as they surrounded Alex. They lifted him onto their shoulders and moved him out the door. I yelled at them to put him down. At least I think I did. Honestly, it was all so much in so little time that I may have just let out some feral screams rather than saying anything coherent. When I followed them outside, I saw nothing but people stretching in every direction. I legitimately could not determine where the crowd ended. To this day, I have no idea how many people were in that mob, but I want to say it bordered on thousands. Nearly every inch of asphalt, grass, and sidewalk in our cul-de-sac had someone on it. None of them were outside when I got home from work, which couldn't have been more than 10 minutes prior. They each had the exact same disposition and jubilation as Alex's kidnappers, their ecstasy only growing more feverish when they saw Alex arrive on the shoulders of the people who had stolen him from our home. I tried to keep up with him and his captors, but I couldn't fight through the human density. I watched Alex slowly disappear over the horizon amongst a veritable sea of elated strangers. Hours later, the last of the crowd also vanished over the horizon. I have not seen Alex since October 26, 2015. Upon contacting the police, I anticipated the detective would act as others had for the preceding month, but he was unfamiliar with Trivid, nor the word Gristiff. He did not know what it was to be a clavinsting. Instead, in a real twist of the psychological knife, he turned it all back on to me. How about instead of wasting my time, you tell me what a clavinsting is, or what it means to be Gristiff? And of course I did not know. I still do not know. My mom didn't recognize the words anymore. My coworkers did not recognize the words anymore. And it's not like Alex was erased from reality or anything. I still have all of our pictures and all of his belongings. But when I try to speak to anyone about him and what happened, they cut me off and say something like, "So sad about the boating accident. I bet he's happier wherever he is now, though." What truly tests my sanity is the fact that the explanation for his disappearance changes every time I talk to someone about it. It's like they know he's gone, but when they are pressed on the details behind that fact, their mind is just set to say whatever random thing pops into their head. Too bad about the esophageal cancer. That house fire was so tragic. Can't believe he got hit by that drunk driver. The only detail that doesn't change is that everyone is very confident that he is happier wherever he is now, though. I'm not so confident about his happiness or his well-being. In fact, I'm downright terrified that wherever he is starting to look like the man in the army camo, being slowly subsumed by whatever that slick, black, plastic-like material is. And I would give anything to be like everyone else and just forget. I would give anything to experience even a small fraction of that serenity. But I can't forget. I'm assuming this has been going on for a while, and that the cycle will restart once they are done with Alex. With that in mind, I don't watch any movies or television because I'm afraid someday I'll be in front of a screen and I'll hear that emergency broadcast siren, and it'll start over again, and he'll be the one on the throne. I had to take a few Xanax to be in front of a screen long enough to type up this post, which may affect the coherency of it all, and I apologize for that. Now that most of you think I am clinically insane, back to the point of this post. Is anyone else immune, like me? As a manager of a coffee shop, I've dealt with some rude customers over the years, but this one takes the cake. Your coffee sucks, okay? There, I said it. You're a terrible barista, and that little bitch manager of yours isn't helping anything either. I crossed my arms, my face burning red as a fire engine. Ahem. The man whipped around, his intense scowl melting into a wide-eyed stare. Do you want to repeat that for me, sir? Our regional manager is here for a visit, and I don't think he heard you properly. Ivan glowered down at the man, who looked as if he wanted to die right then and there. Well, die again, that is. You see, I work at a coffee shop for the dead. Strange, I know, but don't get it twisted. I haven't kicked the bucket yet myself. I might be dead on the inside, but physically, I'm a living, breathing sack of flesh and bones. At least, until this place kills me. But Kala, if you're alive, then how the hell are you working with dead people? Well, I'm a clairvoyant of sorts. I've always been able to see the deceased and interact with them, just like anyone else. I know. You probably think I'm making this shit up, and I don't blame you, but I can assure you that I'm not lying. Anyhow, the asshole who had just finished berating my employee looked like he'd seen a ghost. I glanced up at Ivan, who stared at the man with an intensity that I've rarely seen from anyone, let alone a 7-foot-tall behemoth like him. I almost felt sorry for the guy, until I remembered what he'd done. And any pity that I might have had for him flushed itself down the shitter. Please, mister. I didn't mean it. Okay. I'm sorry. Is that what you want to hear? Ivan's tree trunk arm shot out, and he grabbed the man by the scruff of the neck. The guy's lot fell to the floor, dousing the tile in coffee. I sighed at the mess, but I didn't move a muscle. This was too good to miss. Tell sorry to Robbie, idiot. Ivan spat in a heavy Russian accent. Sorry, he stammered. I couldn't stop myself from grinning. It's okay, sir. I know you didn't mean it. Robbie beamed, a fox smile plastered across his lips. Ivan then dragged his victim to the door, shoved it open, and violently tossed him to the pavement, giving him a parting message as he did. You are banished. Leave my sight. I watched, trying not to laugh, as the man scampered away. Ha! That was incredible. You really scared the piss out of him, Ivan. I turned to find Frank, our regular ex-biker, chuckling as he sipped his espresso. Yes, he will not have piss to give. Frank and I locked eyes, our brows furrowed. What? I said, still trying to comprehend what Ivan was even going for with that statement. He will not be pissing anymore. Nope. Still nothing. Ivan, I don't think that means what you think it does. Anyway, I'll get this cleaned up. Thanks for sticking up for me, big guy, I said, retrieving the mop bucket from behind the counter. You are welcome, Calla. Now I have report to file, he replied, stomping to the back office. Good luck with that, Frank chimed in, eyeing the mess. The guy left a little bit more than just a spilled latte. My heart dropped into my stomach. Frank was right. A thin trail of dirt and insects led to the door from where the man had been standing. A wide array of different bugs writhed on the ground, crawling in every direction. A knot twisted itself into my gut. Great. Hopefully this won't escalate into anything serious. You remember what happened the last time some freak put me in her crosshairs? Yeah, Nona had to get involved. Voodoo is no joke, Frank said, nodding to the entity with a brown fedora and yellowed newspapers sitting at the back of the shop. I glanced in his direction, pursing my lips. Nona, short for no name, isn't human. The only thing we know about him is that he's powerful, and he's on our side. He's like Aftermath's own personal guardian angel. If he has to step in, that means shit has hit the fan. Hopefully, it's not one of those situations, I replied, the unease settling in my stomach. But I have a feeling that we haven't seen the last of our new friend yet. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 3 days went by with no incidents. Well, none aside from Frank slipping on a napkin and busting his ass on the floor. You can bet your bottom dollar that I'll be holding that over his head for the rest of his existence. But on the 4th day, something strange happened. Excuse me, miss. You have a lot of nerve serving me this abomination. I demand a full refund and a sincere apology. Pure, unabated rage bubbled within me. Mrs. Abbott had always been one of our more difficult customers. She looks like Corpse Bride, but demands to be wined and dined like Cinderella, which has always infuriated me. I was about to give her a piece of my mind when I glanced down at the drink she had in her hand. There were earthworms in it. Not just one, either. I counted at least 8 of the slimy things writhing around in Mrs. Abbott's coffee. My heart dropped, and that feeling of intense unease returned. I am so sorry about this, Mrs. Abbott. I have no idea how this happened. I'll give you a full refund and a coupon for a week's worth of free drinks on the house. She gave me the once-over, her judgmental stare scanning me up and down like I was scum on the bottom of her glass slipper. I suppose that would be sufficient. But if it happens again, you will have a lawsuit on your hands. I promise you that. Yes, ma'am. Understood, I replied, mentally rolling my eyes as I went to prepare her a new dewormed drink. She was talking out her ass. The dead have no judicial system. Still, though, the issue was cause for concern. Hey, Robbie, I said, approaching him with the disturbing concoction after delivering the new espresso to Princess Pretentious. Yeah. What's up, Miss Calla? I'm not getting pissed at you or anything, but I want you to take a look at this. Robbie hobbled up to me, leaning heavily on his crutch. He's only got one leg, and on top of that, he's a genuinely good kid, so I've always had a soft spot for him. But some things are inexcusable. Robbie leaned in, his eyes growing wide as saucers when he caught sight of the worms. Any idea how this could have happened? No. I swear, I would never do anything like that on purpose. And maybe someone put them in after I made the drink. I don't know, Miss Calla. You have to believe me. I could hear the quiver in his voice as he spoke. My heart broke for him. I hated having to grill him like that, but I needed answers. I'm sorry, Robbie. I wasn't trying to accuse you of anything. I know you wouldn't do that. I just need to figure this out so it doesn't happen again. I could see the relief wash over his face when I told him that. Another pang of guilt struck me like a lightning bolt. It was clear that he really cared about his job. I'm going to look around. Just let me know if you see any more creepy crawl eyes. Okay, I said, surveying the area. Robbie flashed me a thumbs up as I stalked over to the empty cups. And that's when I saw them. They were there, clear as day. The cups by the espresso machine weren't empty like they should have been. Worms had been placed at the bottom of each cup in the stack, wriggling in clusters at the bottom of their plastic prisons. I suddenly had a clear picture of what had happened. If someone wasn't paying close attention, it would be fairly easy to zone out and bury the things under a chunk of ice while preparing the order. That must have been what Robbie did. He always was a daydreamer. But that still left one question. Who put the worms in our empty cups? I had a sinking feeling that I already knew the answer. Things only got worse from there. We began finding more and more insects around the shop, to the point where Ivan called an exterminator. And that's saying something, because he's a real cheapskate. Even then, the bugs just kept coming. Centipedes crawling from the sink, roaches scuttling across the floor, the occasional wasp finding its way into Ivan's office. It was getting unbearable. And then, a week after the original incident, something happened. Just like I knew it would. I was preparing Frank's regular blonde espresso when I felt a presence at the counter. Something sinister that made my skin crawl, yet seemed oddly familiar at the same time. I glanced up, dreading what I would find. Nona stood before me, his fedora tipped downward to hide his face. His newspaper was neatly tucked beneath his arm, and a gloved hand rested on the countertop. I'd interacted with him a handful of times before, but I still haven't managed to get used to the menacing aura he radiates. Wait. Let me guess, I said, trying to subdue the quiver in my voice. Something bad is coming. Nona's response left me stunned. Normally, the harbinger of doom would leave me with only a cryptic answer, one that warned of immense danger, but this time was different. I'll handle it. I stood there, jaw nearly hitting the floor, as the entity returned to his seat and unfolded his newspaper like nothing had happened. Okay, I said, turning to Robbie, who wore an equally puzzled expression. I guess we'll leave it up to him. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The real fun didn't start until the next day. I was fairly certain that nothing crazy would go down. Nona hadn't come in yet, so being the all-knowing, I think. Being that he is, I just assumed that we were safe, but I was dead wrong. It began with a housefly. Just one, lazily buzzing around the counter. I sighed, thinking that it was just a straggler. I watched as it flew around the near-empty shop, eventually landing on Frank's table. He swatted at it, but missed, smacking the tabletop with a loud thud. Kala, are you sure that Ivan really called an exterminator? Awfully coincidental that he had to go away on business right after the problem arose, don't you think? Believe me, I know how it looks, but I was here when the dude stopped by. Ivan still hasn't shut up about how expensive it was. Just be glad that you don't have to put up with his bitching. Heh, small blessings, I guess, Frank said, taking the sip from his espresso. Small blessings indeed. My attention shot to the door. I hadn't even heard anyone come in. But the second that my eyes landed on the man in the entryway, my blood turned to ice. It was him, the bug man. I knew that I probably hadn't seen the last of him, but he'd shown up when I'd least expected it. None of my guardian angels were there to defend the place. Ivan had left to manage another location a day prior. Nona was off doing God knows what. Hell, I didn't have Robbie there to thwack the guy with his crutch a few good times. It was just me and Frank. And I knew damn well that Frank wasn't going to do jack shit. As I was saying, the creep continued, reveling in the stupor scrawled across my visage. It really is a blessing that I picked today to pay you a visit. Being that the shop is so empty and all. The room fell silent as I tried to think of a way out of our predicament. But in that moment, the only thing I could focus on were the insects surrounding our unwanted guest in all directions. Whoa, what are you? Frank stammered. I rolled my eyes. You should never ask these things what they are, even as one of the dead. Frank knew that. It just gives them an excuse to brag about themselves before they tear you limb from limb. What am I? The man replied, feigning shock. If you must know, my name is Khepri, Lord of the Insects. I am the one responsible for your little pest problem as of late, but I presume that you had already gathered as much. He glanced between Frank and me, gauging our expressions. He must have determined that we weren't terrified enough, because he lifted his hands, and the creepy crawlies surrounding him surged into the shop. My eyes grew wide as dinner plates. We were in hot water. Spiders and mantises and beetles piled over the counter, trampling each other in their haste. I backed away, looking behind me. No luck. There were even more of the little monstrosities blocking my exit. I was trapped. My heart thundered in my chest as Khepri approached me. Hundreds of tiny bodies tumbled off of him with each minuscule movement. I was paralyzed, too afraid to move. Frank's eyes locked with mine, pleading for help. He wasn't faring much better. He was standing on a coffee table, cornered by the sea of insects. Come on, Nona. What the hell is taking so long? I grumbled, futilely swiping away at the small army crawling up my leg. You really shouldn't have crossed me, girl. It's unfortunate that your superior is absent. Your transgressions will cost you dearly. I was beginning to think that he was right. I didn't know where Nona was or what he was doing, but I realized that there was a possibility that he wasn't going to show up. Now then, are you familiar with this creature? Khepri asked, opening his hand to reveal a pitch-black spider. It reared back, bearing a pair of sharp, pointed fangs. My heart plummeted, and I knew then that I was in real danger. In case you weren't aware, this is the Sydney funnel web. It is one of the most venomous arachnids on the planet, with the ability to end a human's life in a mere 15 minutes. But don't take my word for it. You're going to find out firsthand. My mind raced, and my legs felt like they were made of lead, but I knew what I had to do. I turned, prepared to flatten any bug that dared to stand between me and the exit, but I couldn't move. Thousands of legs scurried across my skin. The insects didn't bite. They didn't sting. But what they did do was much worse, considering the situation. The little creatures banded together to keep me rooted to the spot, effectively immobilizing me. My eyes grew wide as reality smacked me like a ton of bricks. I was going to die. You really thought you could escape so easily? Ha, puny human. To me, you are nothing more than an insect, a vile worm that needs to be squashed. And I am about to do just that. Khepri grinned maniacally as he brought the spider closer to my neck. I struggled to fight against my constraints, but it was no use. I didn't even manage to dislodge a single ant. This was it. I shut my eyes, fully expecting to feel twin fangs piercing my neck at any moment. But to my relief, they never did. Nona had seemingly materialized out of nowhere behind Khepri. His gloved hand snatched the spider away, and I think he ate it. All I know is that I heard a muffled crunch, and the Sydney funnel web was gone. No, you're not supposed to be here. I summoned you into my trap. This can't be happening. All the color had drained from Khepri's face, and he looked as if he wanted to pass out. I didn't blame him. In that moment, the aura that Nona radiated was downright malevolent. He clearly wasn't happy about being tricked. Look now, I'm certain that we can negotiate some kind of deal. Surely there's something you must want, Khepri probed, shrinking back into the counter. Nona didn't respond. He just pointed behind me, his signature fedora still concealing his face. I took that as my cue to look away. And the moment I did, the screams began. Guttural shrieks of agony erupted throughout the shop, echoing off the walls. I winced at the sound of bones snapping and the wet squelch of entrails slapping the floor. After a tense moment, the insects holding me prisoner all dropped dead, releasing me from their hold. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of tiny bodies lay scattered in heaps throughout the shop. I chanced to look at Frank, knowing that my savior was out of sight behind the counter. He was absolutely mortified. His eyes looked as if they were going to pop out of their sockets at a moment's notice, and he was huddled against the window, trembling. I didn't blame him. He had a front row seat to the action. Suddenly, Nona rose to his feet, his job finished. There was no trace of Kepri, aside from a streak of blood on Nona's fedora. "Ah, thanks for saving me, buddy. Maybe get here a little earlier next time, if you can." I was about half a second away from joining these little buggers, I said as the adrenaline began to wear off. Noma simply flashed me a thumbs up, then proceeded to consume handfuls of the tiny carcasses, shoveling them into his face hole, maw, endless void. I dunno, whatever he's hiding under there. I was grateful for his help. I was going to need it. "Hey, Calla, I'm gonna go home now," Frank said, interrupting my train of thought. He was already beginning to climb over the booth on his mission to avoid stepping into the sea of dead insects. "Okay, see ya, Frank," I replied, giggling as I watched him clamber over a table. "I'm going to close the shop for the day anyway. Nona and I have a lot of cleaning to do." Last time, the house that sleeps during the day. I moved into the house on Merrill Lane because I was out of options. The ad said it was perfect for night owls and came with furniture, utilities, and rent so cheap it felt like theft. The landlord's voice on the phone had been distant and hurried, like he was eager to be done with me. "You can move in at sunset," he said. I asked if I could arrive earlier to look at the place, but he cut me off with a terse, "Don't disturb it during the day." I laughed, thinking it was a bad joke. It wasn't. The house was strange the moment I saw it. The shutters were thick and bolted, the kind you'd expect during a hurricane, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. A faint layer of dust coated the walkway, though no footprints disturbed it, not even the landlord's, who handed me the key with shaky hands and avoided looking at the door for too long. "If anything unusual happens," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "just wait until nightfall. It's better then." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and walked briskly down the driveway, never looking back. I should have walked away right then, but I didn't. That first night, the house was quiet. The furniture was old but sturdy, the air faintly smelled of cedar, and the fridge was stocked with basics. It felt normal, safe. I chalked up the landlord's weirdness to social awkwardness. Around midnight, though, the first sound came, a low creak from the ceiling, like someone shifting their weight. I froze, staring up at the old wooden beams. Then it came again, soft, deliberate footsteps moving across the floorboards above me. The thing is, I'd already checked upstairs when I moved in. It was empty. I told myself it had to be the house settling, maybe an old pipe shifting, and tried to ignore it. But then the footsteps stopped directly above my bed. Now, the house doesn't sleep at all. The whispers follow me from room to room, sometimes growing loud enough to drown out my thoughts. Last night, I woke up to find muddy footprints on my bedroom ceiling. They weren't mine. I tried leaving again this morning, but the house retaliated. The walls groaned, the air grew heavy, and I felt something icy wrap around my wrist, pulling me back inside. It whispered, "Stay," and for the first time, I whispered back, "Why?" It laughed. "I don't think it's going to let me leave. And the truth is, I'm starting to think I don't want to." The whispers feel familiar now, like an old friend. Tonight, the voice said my name, and I answered. In Oklahoma, when I was 13. This is always a fun story to tell. I haven't told it in a while, but it's a personal encounter so that I can honestly say this all happened. I am 32 now, and I don't know what to think about it. Truthfully, I try not to think about it too much. Anytime I do, I end up sleeping with the light on. I was hitting the age where I didn't want to hang out with my family anymore. Family trips to the grocery store and Walmart were boring to me. Even with the promise of a movie before and a restaurant meal after couldn't get me to leave the house. Nothing could compare to having the whole home to myself. My parents were understanding about this, and surprisingly, that didn't mind me going my own way. My dad would even go out of his way to rent me a random video game if they were going out of state. I was king when they were gone. I would use my allowance to get snacks and set up my console in the living room on the big screen. Fun times. It started in the middle of the school year. I was in middle school, 7th or 8th grade. I don't remember which. I just remember jolting awake in the middle of the night. Looked around my room, saw the clock. 3:00 a.m. I am not a morning person. I sleep hard. It was annoying and unusual to be this awake this early. I turned over and tried to go back to sleep. The next night, I woke up again. When I looked at the clock and saw it was exactly 3:00 a.m. again, and it bothered me a little. This had never happened before, and to have it happen 2 nights in a row was making me nervous. I am a Kickapoo tribal member, and we have stories about shit in the night. My head immediately jumped to the worst ones, and I certainly didn't want any part of that. The reasonable part of my mind was telling me it's probably a normal thing. Just move the curtains and look out the window. Nothing is gonna be there. It's irrational fear. The night just a time of day when the sun is up. Lack of light doesn't mean anything, even if it's 3 a.m. I will be honest, never once did I give in to that idea. I live in the country of Oklahoma next to the woods. My curtains and blinds were closed at night always. This would continue on and off for a few weeks. Always exactly 3 a.m. Always a sudden jolt, never a slow stir. I began to lose my fear of it. It was becoming normal to point of annoyance. Then came the time where my mom needed to go and help some tribal members in Mexico with traditional work. It was going to be a 3-day trip. 1 day to get down there, 1 day to help, and 1 day driving back. There was gonna be lots of family, and all my sisters wanted to go. As you can imagine, not my scene. I asked to stay home, rented a video game, and said my goodbyes. Hugs, kisses, and I was home alone. Oven pizza and gaming started the night. I was chilling on the couch. It was around 9 p.m. Doors were locked. My aunt was just down the road if I needed anything. My youngest sister was still on a tricycle kick, so there was this purple tricycle with ribbons on the handles and unicorn stickers always in the way somewhere. Today, it was behind me where the kitchen meets the living room. I am gaming. Volume is up to take advantage of the lack of sleeping people. Suddenly I hear it. It's a giggle. Like a little kid laughing. It was so real. I thought my little sister was home for a sec. I turned around and gave a quick glance, but nothing was there. I paused the game. I was so sure I heard it, but all was quiet. I got annoyed with myself. Clearly it was a sound in the game I was playing. My brain just had an audio hallucination from some of the background music or sound effects. I unpaused the game and go about my night. About 15 or so minutes later, I hear it again. This time I was sure it came from behind me. A giggle. A little girl's. I paused and muted the TV. It had come from the direction of the tricycle, slightly to the right and back of where I was sitting. My heart was pounding. I wasn't sure of what to do. I kept looking at the bike, expecting something to happen. Not taking my eyes of it, I walked over to the wall and turned on the light. I had the whole house dark for gaming. When nothing happened and my heart calmed down, I braved my way into the kitchen and started flipping light switches. I looked around for anything that could put me at ease, something that could have made that noise. There was nothing. I slept with the light on. The next day I had moved on. It was daylight, and I was beginning to suspect it was my mind playing tricks on me. I watched movies and gamed all day. I had chips and dip for dinner, and it came back around 9 p.m. Same scenario, but it was while I was marathoning Star Wars. I did want to be scared, and I couldn't really do anything about it, so I would give it a glance and then ignore it. The third time it happened, I even mustered enough courage to yell at it. "Shut up," I said, still pretty proud of that. But in hindsight, I probably shouldn't have engaged whatever it was. The third day was the worst. My family was driving back. They had already called. It was maybe noon. I forget. It was broad daylight though. I don't even remember what I was doing, but I heard the back door slam shut. I have cousins who live on the same street. It wasn't unusual for them to just walk in, but it was rare enough to warrant suspicion. I peeked towards the kitchen, expecting to see somebody walk around the wall. It's literally like 5 steps to the back door. After a few seconds, I realized it wasn't any of my cousins. The floor creaks when people walk in the kitchen, and there was no creaking. I heard my parents' door shut. Not slam, but shut. That's when I really panicked. I grabbed the phone and dialed my dad. I don't know why, but I didn't know what else to do. Luckily, he picked up after the first ring. I told him somebody was in the house and that I was scared. He got mad immediately and told me to go see who it was. Honestly, his anger was exactly what I needed. It brought me back down to earth. He stayed on the line while I grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer. I walked around the kitchen, then the back door, and then my parents' room. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I explained the noise away to my dad, but he still told me where the keys were to the gun safe. I pulled my rifle out and stashed it in my room, just in case. My family came home that night, and things went back to normal. My version of normal. The 3 a.m. nights started back up. Then they started getting worse. I wasn't just waking up anymore. I would become conscious, but would be paralyzed. Someone would be sitting on me with their knees on my chest. I wouldn't be able to breathe or open my eyes. I could move my fingers and toes, but that was it. I would struggle, and just when I was about to run out of breath, I would be freed and jolt upright for air. Always at exactly 3 a.m. I don't remember how long this went on before I broke. Not long, maybe a week. I only saw it one time. The last time it happened. I was paralyzed and struggling. My head wasn't upright this time. It was resting on my pillow to the left, with my eyes facing my bedside. I don't know why, but I was bound and determined to open my eyes during the struggle. It was like trying to lift a barbell with my lashes. My toes wiggled and I tried raising my body, but my limbs were so tired. Finally, with significant effort, I could feel my eyelids raising slightly. I could make out my shelf and a little bit of my window. Everything was so dark. Then I realized I was looking at it. It wasn't just dark, it was the dark. Like a solid shape made from black. My eyelids were still mostly closed, so I couldn't see it very well, but it was right next to me. We made eye contact. Its eyes were red, like 2 little beads of red in the dark. The moment we made eye contact, it shocked me, like I had grabbed an electric fence. My body vibrated painfully. My eyes closed again, and a few seconds later I was released. It was 2:59 a.m. Was pretty disturbed by that. Didn't want to go back to sleep until early dawn. That morning I told my dad. I told him everything, bawled my eyes out. He told me to stop crying and got mad I didn't tell him sooner. We went to my grandparents' house down the road, and my grandfather and him had a ceremony. They made me a medicine pouch. When it was done, my dad gave it to me and told me to never lose it. Always keep it in my home. It all stopped after that. No more 3 a.m. wake-ups, no doors slamming, no paralyzing. I haven't heard or seen anything since. I think back on it now, wondering how much of it was real. I can explain away the paralysis and the 3 a.m. stuff, but then I remember the doors and the giggles. I wasn't an over-imaginative 5-year-old. I was 13, basically a young man. It happened, and I don't know what to think about it. I wonder what would happen if I were to lose my medicine pouch. My grandfather has passed since then. I don't know if I could get another one. Would it come back? I have no intention of finding out, though I almost did once. I had pulled out the pouch for a show and tell with some friends while trying to get laid. I didn't put it back in my drawer. A few weeks later, I had to turn my apartment inside out looking for it because I was about to move. I learned it's not an interesting toy to show off. It's my protection. Never again. If you guys have any similar stories, I would love to hear it. Maybe somebody knows what it was. I have a few ideas myself, but like I said, I try not to think on it too often. The man on the train keeps getting taller. Doubt anyone is gonna believe me, but I don't care. I recently just opened a convenience store I have spent over a year trying to open. Since we just opened, and I only have one part-time employee right now, I pretty much work 7 nights a week. I have to take the last train every night at around 1 a.m. to get home. With this being so routine, I start to see the same people on the train every night. One man in particular I have seen every night for the last 2 weeks. He's a middle-aged man with a beer belly and always wears the same Dodgers baseball cap. These last few nights, something has changed. It started last Saturday. He came on the train and sat on the other side of the train car as normal. And I know this sounds stupid, but I swear he was a few inches taller. Not terribly noticeable, but I swear on my wife's grave his head usually goes to just below the handlebars on the ceiling. But that night his head was the same height as the handlebars. At first I just shrugged it off. Maybe he was slouching before, or I just was misremembering. Monday night was when I knew something was wrong. He was at least a foot taller. He now had to duck under the handlebars just to sit down. I wish I had pictures of before and after so you knew I wasn't seeing things. I don't know how he's doing it, but he's getting taller, day by day, night by night, inch by inch. The mere thought of this impossible scenario had been eating away at my mind like a termite. I didn't see him Tuesday night, but when I was taking my kids to the park, that morning I could have sworn I saw him at the park, so tall he towered over the swing set. He had to be over 2 feet taller at that point. I tried telling my part-time employee that night, but he looked at me like I was telling him I saw an alien. I don't even blame him. Your boss you just met starts ranting to you about how a man getting taller on the train. Why would you believe him? What if it's just a different guy? He says, as if I hadn't considered that at all. On Wednesday I spent my entire day looking up ways people could become taller. All I found were bizarre stretches and extremely sketchy surgeries. And even then, the most they could give you was a foot. And when he got on the train that night, he had to duck his head so it didn't hit the roof of the car. He had to be at least 3 feet taller now. For the next few nights, he didn't get much taller, but he did get lankier. His arms became stretched to the point of almost touching his ankles. His neck became horribly outstretched to the point of being disgusting to just look at, with the bumps of his spinal cord showing through his skin like a hairless, starved dog. His hair became longer as well, his Dodgers cap barely able to contain the mess of long black strands loosely falling off either side of his crazed face. The worst part, however, every night, despite how monstrous he looked, he would walk on the car, sit in his same spot, and patiently wait for his stop before calmly walking off. I can't focus. How am I supposed to even rationalize this in my mind? My mom thinks I am just distraught over my wife's death, but how am I supposed to explain what is really happening? I won't go into detail about every day, but trust me, he changed every single night. Sometimes noticeably, like gaining a few inches in height. Sometimes he barely changed at all. But every time something was a little bit different. All the time I spend at the store, I'm distracted. I have gone onto different train cars and he still gets on. I have even switched cars after he gets on, and he's on the other cars as well. He's in every car at the same time. I tried to explain this to my mom when she came to pick up my kids. She is worried about me. No one believes me. I don't even know if I believe me. This man has entered my life and poked and prodded at my sanity until I feel my grip on reality slipping like a bar of soap through my fingers. What's stopping him from approaching me, attacking me? Why does he just sit there? I started a nervous shaking that stays with me all day. The thought of what the man will look like tonight stays in the back of my mind, like an itch I could never scratch. Last night he walked in, bones cracking like thin ice with every step. His skin so tightly pressed against his bones you could every ligament on every visible joint. The only clothing he now had was a pair of ripped up track pants and his Dodgers hat. After seeing how monstrous he became and his complete lack of any sort of reaction to my presence once again, I decided to do something I had never done before. I decided to sit in a different seat. I usually stay near the back of the train car because he usually sits at the front. Just 3 stops away from where he usually gets off, I decided I was going to sit in the seat that is right in front of him. After taking 3 deep breaths and leaving any worry behind, I got up and made my way to the empty seat across from him. As I sat down, he didn't even register my existence. I had never seen him at this angle before. Getting a better look only served to fill me with heart-pounding fear and regret. His eyes were sticking out from the sides of his head, his pupils milky white, like a blind old dog. What used to be his nose now extended outward like a deer's snout. His teeth were sharp as bear teeth, and were always snarled like a threatened lion protecting their young. I sat there just staring deep into its eyes. I'm not a religious man, but looking at this haunted figure in front of me, I knew in my heart I was staring at some unholy creation that crawled from the depths of hell just to torment me with its uncanny presence. As we left the last stop before the creature's usual destination, it finally spoke. Sandy, Luke, Jonathan, Christine, Mark, Liam, Melissa, Alexander. It was saying my family's names, from my late wife and children to my mother and cousins I haven't seen in years. Unmoving, unflinching, and without so much as a twitch in the ice of its eyes, it listed name after name. My grandparents, my brother, my nieces, nephews. When it ran out of family, it even began saying the names of friends from college and old high school crushes I had. I felt my fists curl into a ball on my knees as I sat there and listened to this alien creature list off everyone I could ever hold dear to me. Until finally, it was its stop. Like every night before, it got up calmly without saying another word and walked off the train into the black void of the night. Whatever I had left of my mind was broken into pieces. This needed to end one way or another. When this first started noticing these changes, I immediately tried to hire on more help at the store so I didn't have to take the train anymore. I even interviewed a few candidates. Some of them were very good for the position. But every time I went to call them to tell them they got the job, something came over me, and I told them they didn't make the cut. As if someone was pupating my words, I would open my mouth to say you got the job, and by the time I closed it again, the call was over, and they weren't hired. I can't do this. After last night, this cannot continue. With my kids staying with my mom now, no one questioned me getting a Glock G19. I hate guns. They terrify me, but the thing at the other end of the train car terrifies me even more. I spent my entire shift today looking at the gun in my desk drawer, preparing in my mind as to what I was even planning on doing. Getting on the train, I still had no idea. When the creature stepped back on, it looked the same as yesterday. The first time in days, it hadn't made a noticeable difference. At the next stop, before I could even think of a plan of action, I got up, ran up beside it, pointing the barrel at its impossibly deformed skull, and fired. The creature made no noise as it slumped to the side, its nightmare-inducing body falling limp on the seats beside it. For a split second, I saw the figure turn back into the man it once was, just for a fraction of a second. I bolted out off the train. As I ran down the station, I caught a glimpse of the other cars as I ran. There were hundreds of the creatures in each car, motionlessly staring directly at me as I ran. I write this on the bridge just 3 miles away from the train station. I write this not as a justification, but rather an explanation and one last chance to say I love you. I love you, Sandy. I love you, Luke. And I love you, Jonathan. I love you, Mom and Dad. Everyone who will demand an explanation, I hope this provides you some clarity. I'm sorry the hurt I have caused. I hope I have defeated the man on the train, and God can look me with grace as I did all I could to defeat this embodiment of hell that crept into my life. But one thing I know for certain, if he doesn't hear my prayers tonight, that won't be the last I see of the man on the train. There is a legend about a roaming place that travels up and down the coast to harvest. My dad lost his job, and Mom got demoted, but they didn't want to give up on our annual vacation, so we went to a town on the coast called Oblith. It was primarily a fishing town and smelled of fish guts. The water was cold. The beach was rocky and mossy and filled with long, stringy plants that the sea had regurgitated. In our motel, For the first few minutes, the water from the faucets ran rust red and tasted like iron, facts which the manager explained as actually beneficial to you and a natural product of the local soil. He drank an entire glass to demonstrate how safe it was. There was a painting on the wall of what looked to me like the manager, but he claimed it was his great-grandfather who'd built the motel. The townspeople were on the whole nice and implored us to see the cove. The cove was quite picturesque, separated almost entirely from the sea, like a naturally formed bowl, and the water inside was warm, apparently heated from below. It was no wonder so many townspeople liked spending time there, wandering the rim of the bowl. When we arrived, the only other tourists in Oblith were already there, splashing about. Mom and Dad stripped down to their bathing suits and slipped into the water. I stayed on the rim, on my phone, reading about Oblith. There was very little information. I heard my mom comment that the water was comfortably warm. Almost too warm, Dad said. And when I looked up, I saw what seemed like steam rising from the surface. All around the rim, the townspeople had stopped walking, spread at equal intervals, and lifted their arms. One of the tourists screamed then. Ribbons of seaweed were crawling up her body, and Mom's and Dad's binding, holding them in place. The townspeople chanted. My dad yelled at me to run, and I set off away from the cove, scrambled up a nearby rocky slant, and turned just in time to see, through thick mist, the silhouetted figures of my parents and the tourists disappear. The steam cleared, and the water was red. The chanting subsided. The townspeople dispersed. I looked for a police station, but there were none, and in all the houses I passed I imagined people at their faucets, sucking like fish. Eventually I hitchhiked away. The woman who gave me a ride asked me why I'd come out here. I mentioned a town, but she said there wasn't one, and we drove through empty landscapes. See, there is a legend about a roaming place that travels up and down the coast to harvest, but it would be many years, when I had my own family, before I first heard about it. What about my parents? I asked. That the unproductive give up their vigor for ones who truly do. That's no crime. It's economics, she said, and she told me of the factories she owned and the investments she had made. Then she took a drink of pink, bottled water, and when she turned next to look at me, her face was not human but resembled most a catfish's. I inherited a valuable old Victorian home. I am getting rid of it ASAP after reading my great-great-grandmother's journal. I didn't expect to inherit anything. My grandmother was in her late 80s, sharp as ever but a recluse, living alone in her modest Pennsylvania home. When the call came that she had passed, I braced myself for the usual funerals, family meetings, and the empty routines that follow a death. But the lawyer's voice on the other end of the line carried words I didn't quite believe at first. She left everything to you. You inherit everything. And so, I found myself sitting at my desk a week later, staring at the paper in my hand, which detailed a small bank account, a list of her possessions, and an old home that had belonged to her great-grandmother, passed down the generations to her. I didn't know the house existed before then. The home was located near a small, fog-covered town in Essex County, Massachusetts. The house was old Victorian, from the 1800s. They said many English families had made their way to this part of Massachusetts back in the day. Now the house was mine, an empty thing, left seemingly untouched since the days my great-grandmother had come from England to start life fresh. I couldn't help but think of it as an opportunity. An old, historic home, full of history, full of stories, full of value. I packed my things, closed the door to my small Philadelphia apartment, and made my way to the old house with dreams of making it profitable, restoring its charm, selling it at a premium, and starting over with a huge stack of cash. The house came into view as I pulled down a narrow road at the end of a steep hill. It was huge and unmistakably old, with 2 stories of pale wood, steep gabled roofs, and high windows. I had looked for the best reviewed realtor in the area ahead of time and had him meet me there. I parked in the gravel driveway and climbed out of my car. The realtor was waiting on the porch, his hand already outstretched waiting to greet me. He had the look of a professional, sharp and well put together. "Hello, welcome," he said as I approached. His voice was smooth and steady, and he looked at me with an easy smile. "I'm Samuel Drake. It's good to meet you. I'll be helping you through the sale of this property, making it as pain-free as possible for you." I shook his hand and looked at the house again. It looked lived in, almost, despite being vacant for so long. "Yes, thank you for meeting me here," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. Drake glanced back toward the house, as though he'd already been thinking about this. "This house has a lot of value. Properties like this one, historic homes in this part of Massachusetts, they're rare. With a bit of cleaning and repair, this could easily sell for close to $1 million. There's interest here, especially with the old Victorian charm and the history behind it. It's a prime candidate for restoration." I stared back at him, caught off guard. Almost $1 million. The number hung in the air for a moment. I wasn't sure how I'd expected this trip to go, but I hadn't expected to hear that. "Really? That much?" I managed to say, surprised at how calm I sounded. Drake nodded, stepping toward the house. "Oh yes, there's demand for homes like this, and with the right work, it could be an easy sale. Nothing that can't be managed with a little attention to detail." Before I could respond, another figure came from the side of the house, tall, broad-shouldered, his hair a bright white that contrasted against his flannel shirt. He looked at me as though he already knew who I was. "Hi there, I'm Jonathan Hale," he said, offering his hand in greeting. His voice was deep, steady, and his handshake was firm. "Hi, Jonathan. Sorry, but who are you?" I asked. "I'm the caretaker. I've been caring for the place for years, 23 to be exact, maintaining the property. Your grandmother employed me to look after this place and make sure it didn't fall into disrepair. It's good to meet you." I shook his hand, feeling the strength in his grip. He looked at the house briefly, as though sizing it up in the same way I was. "You've done a great job keeping this place up," I said, looking around at the house and its well-maintained appearance. Jonathan smiled faintly. "Ah, thank you. But I'm not a young man anymore, so some things have been harder to keep up with. Some things just need attention, but nothing that will be a big problem," he said, and his voice was calm, practical. Samuel clapped his hands together, breaking the brief silence. "Well, let's not waste time. I'll show you inside, and we'll get you started on what you need to know about the house. I can give you the grand tour and go over all the details about market prep." I glanced back at the house again as Samuel led the way toward the door. The house wasn't ominous or cold. It was elegant, if a bit dusty, and it had the air of an old property with stories and history, but nothing that sent a shiver down my spine. I wasn't thinking about ghosts, shadows, or hidden secrets. I wasn't even thinking about the history of my family that had led me here. I was thinking about that number again, close to $1 million. It sounded good. It sounded like freedom. "Yeah, lead the way," I said, following Samuel into the house. Jonathan gave a polite wave as he turned back toward his truck. "Come on inside," Samuel said as he turned toward the house again, motioning to the heavy wooden door. His voice broke the quiet. I followed him up the steps and through the wide front door, its brass doorknob worn smooth. Stepping into the entryway, I could feel the cold from the outdoors ease slightly, replaced by the faint creak of the wooden floors beneath my shoes. The first thing I noticed about the house was its age, but not in a way that felt oppressive or eerie. It felt lived in, as though it was frozen in time. The walls were adorned with pale floral wallpaper that looked faded but elegant. The pattern's intricate swirls of muted green and gold that must have been beautiful in their prime. The grand staircase curved up to the second floor, the dark mahogany polished but showing signs of age. Its wood felt solid under my hand as I touched the banister. "This entryway is one of the most charming parts of the house," Samuel said, looking at me as I took in my surroundings. His hands were clasped loosely in front of him, his voice even and friendly as he gestured around. When this house was built, they really took their time with craftsmanship. Look at this woodwork, staircase, banisters, the original molding around the doors. They don't make them like this anymore. I nodded and took a few steps further into the space, my eyes tracing the patterns on the floor. Oak hardwood. I can see that, I said. The living room was directly to the right of the entryway, through a wide archway. Samuel let me inside, and I could feel the size of the space. It was large, with a high ceiling, ornate plasterwork on the edges, and a massive fireplace that took up almost the entire far wall. The mantel was carved wood, with ivy-like scrolls curling into the corners. The hearth was empty now, cold and gray, but I could imagine it roaring with a fire on a winter's night. This is the original fireplace, here since day one. You'll need to make sure it's cleaned up, but it has good bones. Nothing that needs replacing unless you want to upgrade things. I took in the space. The wide bay windows let in just enough natural light to highlight the faint dust floating in the air. I could almost hear old voices from the past. Laughter, footsteps, the faint clink of teacups. Samuel seemed to catch me staring. It's got a lot of potential. The kind of charm buyers look for. He started moving toward the hallway leading deeper into the house, and I followed. As we walked through the corridor, the sound of our shoes on the floorboards felt almost intrusive, breaking the stillness of the air. The hallway was narrow, lined with doors on either side. Hi there, I'm Jonathan Hale, he said, offering his hand in greeting. His voice was deep, steady, and his handshake was firm. Hi, Jonathan. Sorry, but who are you? I asked. I'm the caretaker. I've been caring for the place for years, 23 to be exact, maintaining the property. Your grandmother employed me to look after this place and make sure it didn't fall into disrepair. It's good to meet you. I shook his hand, feeling the strength in his grip. He looked at the house briefly, as though sizing it up in the same way I was. You've done a great job keeping this place up, I said, looking around at the house and its well-maintained appearance. Jonathan smiled faintly. Thank you. But I'm not a young man anymore, so some things have been harder to keep up with. Some things just need attention, but nothing that will be a big problem, he said, and his voice was calm, practical. Samuel clapped his hands together, breaking the brief silence. Well, let's not waste time. I'll show you inside, and we'll get you started on what you need to know about the house. I can give you the grand tour and go over all the details about market prep. I glanced back at the house again as Samuel led the way toward the door. The house wasn't ominous or cold. It was elegant, if a bit dusty, and it had the air of an old property with stories and history, but nothing that sent a shiver down my spine. I wasn't thinking about ghosts, shadows, or hidden secrets. I wasn't even thinking about the history of my family that had led me here. I was thinking about that number again, close to 1 million. It sounded good. It sounded like freedom. Yeah, lead the way, I said, following Samuel into the house. Jonathan gave a polite wave as he turned back toward his truck. Come on inside, Samuel said as he turned toward the house again, motioning to the heavy wooden door. His voice broke the quiet. I followed him up the steps and through the wide front door, its brass doorknob worn smooth. Stepping into the entryway, I could feel the cold from the outdoors ease slightly, replaced by the faint creak of the wooden floors beneath my shoes. The first thing I noticed about the house was its age, but not in a way that felt oppressive or eerie. It felt lived in, as though it was frozen in time. The walls were adorned with pale floral wallpaper that looked faded but elegant, the pattern's intricate swirls of muted green and gold that must have been beautiful in their prime. The grand staircase curved up to the second floor, the dark mahogany polished but showing signs of age. Its wood felt solid under my hand as I touched the banister. This entryway is one of the most charming parts of the house, Samuel said, looking at me as I took in my surroundings. His hands were clasped loosely in front of him, his voice even and friendly as he gestured around. When this house was built, they really took their time with craftsmanship. Look at this woodwork, staircase, banisters, the original molding around the doors. They don't make them like this anymore. I nodded and took a few steps further into the space, my eyes tracing the patterns on the floor. Oak hardwood. I can see that, I said. The living room was directly to the right of the entryway, through a wide archway. Samuel led me inside, and I could feel the size of the space. It was large, with a high ceiling, ornate plasterwork on the edges, and a massive fireplace that took up almost the entire far wall. The mantel was carved wood, with ivy-like scrolls curling into the corners. The hearth was empty now, cold and gray, but I could imagine it roaring with a fire on a winter's night. This is the original fireplace, here since day one. You'll need to make sure it's cleaned up, but it has good bones. Nothing that needs replacing unless you want to upgrade things. I took in the space. The wide bay windows let in just enough natural light to highlight the faint dust floating in the air. I could almost hear old voices from the past. Laughter, footsteps, the faint clink of teacups. Samuel seemed to catch me staring. It's got a lot of potential. The kind of charm buyers look for. He started moving toward the hallway leading deeper into the house, and I followed. As we walked through the corridor, the sound of our shoes on the floorboards felt almost intrusive, breaking the stillness of the air. The hallway was narrow, lined with doors on either side. Most of the rooms had wooden frames around their entryways, with faded floral patterns matching the wallpaper in the foyer. This house has 6 bedrooms, Samuel said, pausing as he gestured to a door on the right, and a formal dining room, a parlor, and a butler's pantry off the kitchen. The roof was redone about 30 years ago, so it's solid and in good condition. Most of the upkeep has been maintenance here and there, like addressing cracks in the plaster, ensuring the old piping works well. We stepped into one of the rooms, which was bright even with the overcast sky outside. The walls were pale blue with white trim, and there was a single large window letting in light. The bed frame was gone, but the size of the space was impressive. High ceilings, wooden floors, and a small wardrobe sitting against one wall. It doesn't look like much now, but this will be ideal for staging or showing, Samuel added, looking around the space. These rooms will shine with just a fresh coat of paint and a little attention. You can decide on how much you want to invest in repairs. Honestly, I think you'll find that the charm of the house and its history will speak for themselves to buyers with minimal upgrades. I glanced back at him, taking the space in again. What about the yard? The bushes out front and the overgrowth. It looks like it's been a while since anyone worked on the landscaping. Samuel nodded in agreement. Yes, we should focus on the outside. It won't be anything you can't handle with a little time. The older gentleman who helped with the property mostly focused on maintenance inside, so the garden and surrounding foliage have gotten a bit wild over the years. If you want, I can give you a few contacts for local landscapers. It might save time. I looked through the window at the backyard. The yard stretched back into a forest of trees, old pines and maples. It looked like an untouched wilderness, which would only add to the appeal for the right buyer, but still felt like it would need attention. It's fine, I'll take care of it myself, I said, knowing I couldn't afford landscapers. It was clear this was going to be a lot of work, but nothing that seemed insurmountable. Not yet anyway. Anything else I should know before diving into this? Samuel offered a thin smile and gestured toward the front windows as he leaned his hands on the wall. Nothing major. The house is solid overall, but the age will always bring its quirks, old pipes, old wiring. But you'll see all of that as you get started. The real key is cleaning up the place without losing the original character. That's what buyers are looking for. I took a deep breath, looking back at the large living room and its worn yet graceful design. All right, I said, taking another look at the hallway. Well, let me get started. Samuel gave another easy, confident smile and led the way as he showed me the rest of the home. After Samuel wrapped up the tour, his parting words were brief and professional. If you need anything, just give me a call. I look forward to working with you. He gave me a firm handshake by the door and departed, leaving me alone with the house. I stood in the quiet entryway for a moment, staring at the door as it clicked shut behind him. The house felt much larger and quieter now that I was alone. I shook it off, grabbed my duffel bag from the couch, and made my way into the living room. I set up a fire in the large stone fireplace with a few logs I'd found in the yard. I ordered some takeout from a local Chinese place and sat cross-legged on the living room floor with my carton of sesame chicken. After dinner, I laid out my sleeping bag near the fire. I wasn't planning to waste money on hotels or anything while I was here, so it made sense to just sleep in the living room for now. It was warm, cozy enough. The first night passed without incident. I slept deeply by the fire, the warmth keeping the cold air outside at bay. My mind was thinking about money and the tasks I needed to complete as I drifted off, and I didn't stir until the first light of morning shined through the windows. I woke to the sound of birds in the trees and a thin streak of sunlight cutting through the curtains. I could feel the soreness in my throat from a night sleeping in dusty air next to a fire, but I forced myself up and stretched. Today would be the first real day of getting to know the property, of starting the hopefully short road to cleaning and preparing it for sale. I grabbed my coat, a pair of gloves, and my work boots from the front hall, then made my way the front door into the chill of the morning. The first few hours of yard work felt productive, if not exhausting. Around noon, I decided I needed a break. My hands were raw, my arms sore, and the cold wind felt like it went right through my coat. I leaned my rake against an old oak tree in the front yard and stood for a moment, staring at the house. I wiped my nose with my sleeve and decided that it would be good to poke around a little more inside. I had some time to kill, and the house had plenty more to see. I wandered through the house slowly, this time on my own without Samuel as a guide. I let my curiosity lead me. The rooms felt different when you explored them without purpose. It was fun exploring the place, and I was hoping maybe I'd find a secret room or something interesting. I started opening doors one by one, rooms filled with antiques, covered furniture, and other knickknacks. Upstairs, toward the back of the house, I found another room. It wasn't locked, but there was a resistance when I turned the handle, as though the door had been forgotten or avoided for a long time. I hesitated for just a moment, then pushed it open. The room was dim, the light barely reaching it through a small window. There were trunks, old ones, wooden and worn, and a writing desk by the window. I could see scraps of paper scattered on the desk, some of them half buried beneath dust and age. The smell hit me first, a faint mustiness. I walked over to the desk and began to examine the papers, brushing the dust off the top. What I found made my breath catch. It was a journal. The leather cover was aged and worn, and the pages were filled with elegant handwriting in a style that was old, deliberate, and beautiful. It was difficult at first to read. It used words and phrasing I wasn't used to, but as I read, I felt my excitement grow. The journal clearly belonged to my great-great-grandmother. Excited, I took the journal back downstairs with me, setting it on my sleeping bag with plans to read it in the evening once I was done with my yard work. I finished up my work outside, feeling sore but accomplished. I ordered dinner from a local pizza place, eager to sit by the fire, warm and quiet, and read the journal I had found earlier. After setting up my food and lighting a fresh fire, I sat on my sleeping bag and picked up the journal. I flipped it open to the first page and began to read. The first passages felt simple enough. Descriptions of daily life, observations of neighbors, the excitement and trepidation of starting fresh. She wrote about life in England, the decision to leave it all behind, and the first time she laid eyes on the house. The dialect was a little tough to follow at first, but I got the hang of it. It felt so personal that it was almost overwhelming to read. Her observations about her first few days here were fascinating, how everything felt strange, how every sound in the night felt new and alien. She talked about the neighbors, the local gossip, and the way people in this small New England town would gather at local events. She detailed a boy she fancied, an innocent crush that seemed to consume her thoughts. The pages brought alive a world that felt completely lost to time, a delicate web of thoughts, fears, and joys from someone long gone. It was unexplainable to feel connected to her this way. It was like meeting a ghost, one who felt alive, real, and painfully human. The hours slipped by as I read, each passage a window into a life that felt so personal and so distant. I found myself wishing, in that moment, that my grandmother could have been here to read this. I got to the next page, this one different than the previous. I read. This morn I awoke with a heaviness in my breast, a most unshakable dread that clings to me still. The air within this ancient house is colder than the season should permit, as though the very stones themselves exhale a breath from the depths of time. A feeling hangs here, sinister and unseen, lurking in the shadows of darkened corners, and shifting when my gaze wavers, paths through the dim and drafty corridors. I have listened with great patience, convinced they are no natural sound of earthly origin. At first, I entertained the notion that it was but the old timbers settling beneath the weight of age, but no. These are footsteps with purpose, footsteps that linger, that follow, that watch. They are not wholly of this house. Last night, as I lay in my bed, I thought I spied a shadow in the gloom, a frail, sinister sliver of motion just beyond the edge of the door. My heart leaped within my chest, and I grasped at my prayer book as though it might offer me protection from the unseen. Yet it is no prayer that shall save me should this presence indeed prove real. The sensation of being watched is akin to a cold, unseen hand at the nape of my neck, unyielding and vile. This morning, I spoke of these matters to Henry, careful with my words lest I appear as one given to flights of fancy. His gaze, pale and gray as the mist, met mine, yet he said not a word. Perhaps he thinks I am but given to idle imaginings. But I am not accustomed to such things. I feel them, night and day. This house holds secrets, ancient and restless things. I fear they are no mere figments of my mind. I fear they watch me. I sat for a moment, considering the words I read. I decided to stop there, not wanting to get any further. That night, I went to bed a little more restlessly, noticing the sounds of the old home more, every creak of the old wood sounding just a bit louder. I woke the next morning after a restless night of tossing and turning, my body aching and my throat sore again. I'd hardly slept at all. My muscles hurt from the previous day's work, and the thought of getting back out into the yard to clear more brush didn't appeal to me in the slightest. I managed to force myself outside for a couple of hours, shoveling dirt, pulling stray branches, and trying to make some progress. But by mid-morning, my body had other plans. My hands trembled, my back ached, and I knew I'd hit my limit. I packed it in and went inside, deciding that today wasn't going to be a day for hard labor. I figured a change of scenery might clear my head. I drove into town to a cozy little coffee shop. There was always something about the warm smell of coffee and the sound of people chatting that made me feel better. I brought the journal with me, thinking I might spend some time reading while I was there. I tucked it under my arm as I parked my car and headed inside, glad for the idea of a warm drink and a break from the house for a while. With a coffee in hand, I grabbed a chair by the window and decided to dive back into the journal. The next entry was as follows. This day finds me in a state of profound unease, a weakness that clings to me as though my very soul has been sapped. I wake each morn with the sun, yet there is no vigor in my limbs, no strength in my bones. It is as though some unseen weight bears upon me, pressing down upon me through every hour. The nights are worse. Last eve, as I lay in my bed with the wind howling without, I could hear them again. Footsteps. They came from above, deliberate, heavy, yet there is no one there. My hand clutched at my prayer book, as though it might shield me from these sounds, but it is of no use. The sound is constant, scraping, shuffling. Sometimes they cease, as though waiting, and I lie in the dark, listening with my heart in my throat. The walls, too, seem to be alive with a kind of whispering, a scratching, faint and cruel, as if something moved within them, unseen and hungry. I have tried to convince myself that it is the old house settling, that the sound of age and wood might be mistaken for something sinister. Yet I know better. I know he is there. I hear him. Last night, when I dared leave my bed to see to the door, my breath caught in my chest. Through the crack of the door, which I had left ajar, I swore I saw it. An eye, a great, round, glimmering eye, pale as bone, and fixed upon me with an unyielding stare. I froze as though the very sight had turned me to stone, and I dared not move, nor breathe, nor pray. The feeling is one I cannot describe, for it is as though the darkness knows my heart, as though it sees into me. I fear I am going mad. I feel it in the daytime as well, this presence, a kind of languid despair that creeps into my bones. I am powerless here. I feel the energy of my life draining, as though this house has set its teeth into me and refuses to let go. I pray this is but my own fancy, my mind given over to nerves and strain. But the sounds persist and the eye lingers. I fear the day I will see it again. I fear the day I shall not merely see it through the crack, but see it here beside me. What the hell was going on with her? I wondered to myself. Was she going crazy? Was the isolation getting to her? I felt bad for her in that moment. Away from the house and in a new setting, I was certain she was experiencing some sort of mental health crisis, not understood properly during that time. I read on. Oh. This entry comes with trembling hand and a heart that beats as though it would burst from my chest. I scarcely know how to put these things to paper, for words seem a poor defense against the horrors that now plague me. The eye, that dreadful, unyielding eye, hath returned. I see it again, always through cracks, through the narrowest fissures in doors, through the space at their edges. It watches me, cold and unblinking, as though it hath the power to see into the very depths of my soul. It is no longer confined to my bedchamber alone. Nay, I see it now in every door, those leading to the parlor, to the hallway, to the old kitchen. A terrible, pale orb that waits and watches, and knows me. Last night, I awoke with a jolt, my breath ragged, to see it once more. This time, not merely a hint or shadow, but a full sight, clear in its terrible form. A tall, frail figure stood beside me in the bed, lit only by the cold, pale glow of the moonlight streaming through the window. I could not move, could scarcely breathe, for my terror was as sharp as a knife. I dared not look for long, lest the sight take hold of my reason. I reached for the spill, hands trembling, and lit the candles by my bed. The light grew warm and golden, dancing across the walls and ceiling, and yet when the flame touched the shadows, the figure was gone, as though it had never been. My heart ached with doubt, but the fear remained, cold and cruel. I could not shake the certainty that it would return, that it had been there, and that it would come again. I feel as though the time is near, that some sinister design is being carried out upon me, some foul and terrible thing that I cannot prevent nor escape. It watches, and I feel its unseen plans growing, twisting, tightening like the grip of a noose. I dread what will come next. Will I awaken again to find it beside me? Or will it come through the door, its intentions manifest and unyielding? My mind grows more frantic with each passing hour. I do not know how much longer I can endure this torment, this feeling that something waits, always waits, to bring about its cruel design. I set the journal down for a moment, running my hand over my face. A chill had run up my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling. My chest felt tight, and I wondered if I should stop reading. What if this was a mistake? I didn't want to let old fears and old stories get to me. Maybe I should put it aside, I thought. Maybe reading this was only going to make me more anxious, make me think things I shouldn't. The old house, the old journal, the strange things written within, It was creepy, but it could all just be the ramblings of a lonely 19th century woman. People were more superstitious back then, after all. And yet, I felt bad for her. There was so much fear in her words, so much desperation. But no, it wasn't real, was it? I tried to convince myself of that. These things always feel bigger when you're alone, when you're worn out or stuck in a dark house. It was probably nothing, a creak from wood or a draft coming in through the cracks in the walls. That was all. I wasn't going to let this make me afraid to go back to the house. I picked the journal back up, trying to shake off the tension. I wasn't going to let it get to me. I finished reading this, and it would all make sense. Maybe she worked through it. Maybe she found out it wasn't anything at all in the end. These old stories often have a way of building themselves up, don't they? Fear out of nothing. That's what I tell myself. It was fine. I'd just keep reading. This hand trembles as I write, and my breath comes quick at the very act of putting this to paper. I can scarce hold my quill pen, my fingers so weak and cold, for I know this shall be my last. My soul feels as though it hangs by but a single thread, stretched taut with every passing moment. I awoke again in the dead of night, as though from some restless dream. My heart leaped in my chest at the sight of it. A figure standing at the foot of my bed, as real as the shadows themselves. It watched me, cold and pale, a horrible, unyielding stare. I could not move, nor cry out. I could scarcely breathe. The eyes, those dreadful, pale eyes, followed me, and they were everywhere. Not merely in my bedchamber, nay. It lingered in every darkened corner, through every crack and shadow, in the spaces between doors and walls. It watches me as I went about my duties in the house. It watches me as I descended the stairs or ventured into the kitchen. No matter the place, the gaze is there, unyielding, unblinking, and filled with a terrible knowing. I could not bear it any longer. I made up my mind to confront it, to stare back, to ask it what it wanted of me. Perhaps I could command it away, or find some understanding, some explanation to silence this torment. I rose from my bed, trembling, and took a step toward the door. My hand grasped the handle, my heart pounding with a kind of fury I cannot explain. I pushed the door open, my breath hitching. And there, from the dark, came a hand. It was black as pitch, thin and claw-like, and it reached from behind the door with a slow, creeping motion, like the very hand of death. I could see it through the faint glow of moonlight, gnarled and terrible, grasping toward me. My breath came out in a strangled cry, and I turned and fled. I ran, felt as though I was pursued by all the devils of hell down the narrow hallway. My legs weak beneath me, my voice was lost, and my body moved of its own volition as I sought the only refuge I could find. I hurled open the door and locked it behind me, my hands shaking as I drew the bolt. I sit here now at this very desk as I record what I fear are my final thoughts. The sound persists. The doorknob is moving, rattling against the lock, and I can hear the groan of it as though it is alive. It seeks entry. Perhaps it shall come for me at last. Perhaps my words will be the last act of defiance, the last testament to my fear, my frailty, my hope. But if this is to be my end, then so be it. I fear it no longer. The entry stopped there. I flipped through to the next page to find it empty, as well as the rest of the journal. That was her final entry. With the sun setting, I knew it was time to head back to the house. I couldn't stay in the coffee shop forever, and until I got my big payday, I couldn't afford a hotel. The thought of returning to the house filled me with unease, but I reminded myself why I was here. The faster I got the place fixed up, the faster I could sell it and walk away with more money than I had ever seen. That was the goal, and it was worth enduring a little discomfort, or so I told myself. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was dark outside. I parked and forced myself inside, telling myself it was just another night. The journal and its entries were still fresh in my mind, but I chalked it all up to the ramblings of an isolated, frightened woman. This wasn't reality. This was just an old house. I settled in for the evening, flicking on a lamp to chase away the dark corners. As I tried to focus on a book, something caught my eye. A faint movement, a pale circle, unmoving, peering at me from the narrow crack of a door across the hall. My heart leaped, and for a long moment I couldn't move. It was an eye. It was the eye. Watching me, I was sure of it. But when I blinked and forced myself to look again, it was gone. Nothing but the shadow of the door and my overactive imagination. This den house is getting to me, I muttered, shaking my head. I closed the book and turned in for the night, determined to put it all behind me. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house seemed amplified. At times, I thought I heard movement in the walls, soft, deliberate, like something dragging itself along inside them. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But I told myself it was just the age of the house. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, keeping me glancing over my shoulder. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. Sometime during the night, I woke suddenly. I felt frozen, a deep primal fear washing over me. I knew something was wrong, and I wasn't alone. I didn't want to look, but I forced myself to, becoming aware of something standing in the doorway. It was tall, dark, its frame thin. Its outline was indistinct, but the eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, pale and unblinking, looking directly at me. My breath caught in my throat as terror ran through me. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I was frozen in pure fear. And then it shifted, ever so slightly, as though it were about to step forward. That was enough to snap me out of my frozen state. I bolted upright with some kind of instinctual, pathetic whimper, but the figure was gone. The doorway stood empty, and the room was quiet. I didn't wait. Grabbing my keys, I fled the house, stumbling onto the front lawn, gasping for air. My heart pounded in my ears, and tears streaked down my face as I glanced back at the house. And that's when I saw it again. Peeking from around the edge of the front door, just visible in the dim light, was a shadow, and those eyes, pale, watching me. I didn't stick around to see what it would do next. I got in my car and drove away, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror. But the image of those eyes is forever burned into my mind. I know now what my great-great-grandmother went through was real. I saw it myself. I don't know what happened to her, but I know she must have met a terrible fate. I never went back to the house, and I never will. I want nothing to do with it. I called Samuel Drake and told him I wanted to sell a house as is. I don't care what I get for it at this point. I just want it out of my possession as quickly as possible. Princess with the sharp teeth. I came across a job listing at the right time in my life. I needed to move, and I was short on savings. A farmhouse in the middle of nowhere needed a house sitter. The owners planned to renovate the farm to turn it into an orchard. They had issues with teens breaking into the house and stealing tools to pawn. I would get paid a decent amount to stay in the place and chase away anyone dumb enough to trespass. The house had an internet connection, so I could work remotely. With everything settled, I packed up ready to babysit the house for 2 weeks. Aside from needing groceries, I wanted to be seen around the small town. Places like that rarely had new faces. The town had maybe 2,000 people at most. I received some odd glances as I stocked up. The cashier politely asked why I had stopped in town. I explained where I would be staying and for how long. She nodded along, wishing me luck with the next 2 weeks. Without a doubt, she would spread the information around, which would help cut down on people coming to the house at night expecting it to be empty. I didn't own a gun. I doubted I needed one for this sort of thing. A baseball bat and a crowbar had been left next to the front door in case I did need a weapon. The homeowner told me that I didn't need to risk my life for the property. If someone wanted to rob the place, he would rather have an insurance payout over scrubbing my blood off the floors. I arrived later in the day. The sun almost had set, making it hard to unlock the door in the dim light. My arm ached from carrying all the groceries at once. I dumped them inside the front hallway, then got to work turning on all the lights to see what the layout was. For an older farmhouse, it was a nice place. The living room and a large kitchen took up the first floor. A pair of wooden stairs led to the bedrooms, and there was an unfinished basement that the owner used to store jars of homemade jam. It appeared like the owner started on the renovation, but hadn't decided on what kind of flooring to use. Patches of different types of wood and tile covered the floor. Someone had dragged something large and heavy across the kitchen, leaving deep marks in the mismatched wood. Near the corners, some spots of the floor were ripped out, revealing old hardened glue. It smelled like the rooms were freshly painted. Each piece of furniture looked to be picked up off the side of the road. Honestly, I've lived in the worst places. It was warm with a running shower. What else could I want? I dragged my bags of clothing and personal items from the truck into the master bedroom. The sheets were fresh, which was nice. I spent the first night in bed connecting to the internet and watching movies instead of working. My reports could be done later. When I finally put away my laptop and turned off the light, I almost fell asleep right away. The sounds of the old wooden house settling creaked in the darkness. I never realized how noisy the country nights could be. Some animals off in the distance yawled until the sun rose. I had no idea what lurked inside the fields, however. I wasn't worried. I had strong walls around me. What could go wrong? I woke up early and quickly finished my work for the day. Without much else to do, I decided to do some sightseeing in town. It was during the day. No one would be dumb enough to try and break into the place now. I expected the townsfolk to be overly friendly. Not a single person stopped to talk. It was like they all assumed I had some sort of plague. I also expected a lot of older people. Instead, I passed by mostly others around my age. The stereotype of small towns like this was the younger crowds moved away the moment they were able. Instead of that, I rarely saw anyone with gray hair. After a walk around town taking in the sights and being avoided by everyone, I stopped at a taco truck for an early dinner. At least the workers smiled a little when they served the food. Honestly, it was the best tasting set of tacos I've ever had. Since I wasn't wanted in the town, I retreated to the farmhouse. I hadn't explored the field or the large rundown barn. There were some tracks in the barren fields I didn't know what kind of animal could make. Surely there were lots of creatures living nearby and inside the small plot of woods. One side of the barn door was missing. The sunlight didn't fully reach inside. I took 2 steps forward only to hear a crunching sound under my foot. Glancing down, I saw I had stepped on top of a small bird's skull. All the flesh had been eaten away by insects. I spotted more littered around on the dirt floor. Suddenly, I decided I didn't need to be inside the barn. I made it to the front door when a truck started to come down the long driveway. It stopped to idle for a minute. The back door opened, and a medium-sized dog jumped down. The tail weakly wagged. Then the truck door closed. I shouted at the person driving but couldn't stop them from driving away, leaving the dog behind. I jogged down the driveway, the truck long gone. The dog waited with a slight whine. I wanted to believe the owner had just made a mistake. However, deep down, I already knew this dog had been dumped. I got her back inside the house. We had a nice dinner, and I needed to do something that would hurt the both of us. Princess needed a bath. Her crying broke my heart. It needed to be done. She was a stinky old dog. After that small battle, she was a less stinky old dog. As an apology, I carried her onto my bed to let her cuddle near my head right away. We watched a movie on my laptop, but I found I started to slowly drift off to sleep. It was around midnight when growling woke me. I was so tired I didn't remember where I was or even that I now owned a dog. The fog slowly lifted, and I saw Princess by my side, tense and alert. Aside from her breathing, I heard nothing. I should go downstairs and check it out just in case. I got us out of bed, careful to not make too much noise in case someone broke in. Princess stopped by the door and clearly did not want to leave the room. I pat her head to get her to follow. The house was far too silent and dark. I made a mental note to keep a light on at night from now on. We went down the old wooden steps, slowly listening for any signs we weren't alone. I went from room to room, switching in lights, trying to see what had Princess so spooked. The moment the kitchen light came on, I spotted something in the window the back door. Without a doubt, a pale face had been watching us. Fear shook my system. Then Princess started to bark. She sounded like a young, powerful dog. As she charged towards the door, the face disappeared, and I ran over to grab the baseball bat to head outside. I kept her inside in case she ran off. I didn't see anyone but heard a person running off into the darkness. I shouted a warning at them, hoping they would not come back. The entire experience left me a bit spooked. I hated to think of what would have happened if Princess hadn't woken me up. This good lady would be getting fresh chicken for breakfast again. At least now the local kids should know I was willing to take care of them if they tried anything at the old farmhouse. The lights stayed on all night, and I couldn't get back to sleep. For some odd reason, I felt uneasy being in that house. Every time I looked outside a dark window, I expected to see someone looking back inside. Princess tried to stay awake with me, but she was old and needed her beauty sleep. As promised, she got a nice breakfast. I was too tired from the night before to do much of anything. It was nice to be able to nap in the middle of the day, because I had gotten so much work done the day before. After lunch, Princess was let out to run in the yard. She appeared to be doing much better and had way more energy than before. I sat outside in the cold air watching her have fun. I found myself enjoying this kind of slow life. Since I grew up in the city, I expected something like this to be boring. Now I only regretted I didn't have anyone to share my slow moments with besides Princess. Eat, work, and sleep. That would be my life until I didn't need to watch the house any longer. Or, I assumed it would be. The night brought trouble I never would have expected. I had been so tense from seeing the face in the dark, I wasn't fully asleep when Princess growled again. The baseball bat was next to the bed. I grabbed it and headed downstairs with her on my heels. This time I made noise, hoping it would scare off any kids outside. I reached the kitchen, my hand about to turn on the light when I saw the face again. The sight made me freeze. It took my brain too long to realize something was different. The face was not behind the window, but in front of it. A pair of powerful hands grabbed my neck from behind. They tossed my body to the ground as all hell broke loose. Princess went crazy, barking at the intruders. I swear their numbers increased by the second out of thin air. These weren't local kids out to cause trouble. I didn't know what they were. The pale things appeared human enough, with long messy hair and big black eyes. Sharp needle-like teeth were shown through thin smiling lips. Their bodies were so thin, dressed in rags, and yet I couldn't find myself to get away. So many of those hands pinned me to the ground. I watched helplessly as they reached for poor Princess. She bit down hard on the hand of one of the creatures. More hands reached for her collar, ready to drag her away. Her barking turned to scared yelps. I don't know what came over me. I just saw red. I pushed through the mass of hands, getting cuts all over my skin from their nails. My hand found the handle of the bat as I snatched it off the ground to bring it down as hard as I could, connecting to a creature's skull. The figure dropped, and I wasted no time moving to the next target. By the time I fought away enough creatures, poor Princess had a few cuts near her neck from them grabbing her. My heart raced when I realized I could not kill all of these monsters, but I only needed to clear a pathway to the door. Princess jumped into action as her teeth ripped apart any hands that got near her. My body ached as the fight carried on. Sweat dripped down my face as my muscles burned. We did clear a space, but not enough to get through the crowd to the door. No matter how much I loved Princess, my body could only go so far. I dropped my weapon, panting as Princess growled at my legs. For some odd reason, the creatures didn't try to attack. They all stood around us, black eyes staring at the fallen and smiles never leaving their lips. Meat, one said in a whisper. More started to repeat the word. Louder and louder, the statement rocked the room with countless voices. All at once they fell on their fall. In the chaos, I was able to drag Princess through the crowd and finally upstairs to the bedroom simply because all the doors out were blocked. For hours, I heard those things have a gruesome feast downstairs. It took a long time before my hands stopped shaking enough to call 911. A woman answered and had a professional tone until I told her my location. We cannot send a car out until sunrise. Please do not call again and keep the lines free for people we can actually help. The phone went dead, leaving us alone in that dark farmhouse, filled with creatures that could break down the door at any second. The night had never felt so long. The sounds downstairs started to fade when the sun came out. I waited for at least 10 minutes of silence before risking to open the door. Nothing. No signs any of those creatures came upstairs that night. We raced down to the first floor, the smell of blood overpowering my senses. I refused to look at what those monsters left behind. My foot slipped on the wet floor, but it didn't slow my pace. A man in uniform waited outside by a police car. He held the back door open as I loaded up Princess. I got in the back seat, trusting he would drive us far, far away from this place. I arranged for you to be at a motel a few towns away. You'll be paid for the full 2 weeks of work, and I'll have someone drive your truck over later today. The officer explained. His hair had a streak of gray at the sides. He sounded older than he looked. A photo of him with who I assumed to be his parents hung from his mirror in a plastic case. My head swam with questions. Far too many to ask at once. Those things. I started to mouth dry and my voice weak. We don't know what they are. They appeared demanding we feed them. At first, normal food worked. Then, they wanted meat. Fresh meat. He said evenly without taking his eyes off the road. Bile rose up to my throat as I fully understood what almost happened to me that night. So, you called in someone whom no one would miss. I said, getting heated. He didn't stop driving. On the outside, he appeared calm, but he felt just as upset as I did. We put forth our own first. Nothing in this town dies of old age. He replied with his eyes flickering to the hanging photo. We made a lot of sacrifices. You were nearly one of them. My body slumped down into the seat, feeling defeated. I now feared any answers I desperately wanted. I decided to press forward with 2 more questions. Are they going to come after me? I said in a weak voice. He shook his head, but didn't sound comforting. 3 people have made it out of that house besides you. 2 are still alive, but 1 has disappeared. Those creatures demanded to be fed. In a way, you did just that. He nodded. Why not leave better weapons? If those monsters eat their own, didn't it make sense to give the person inside the house a fighting chance? Those things hate guns. The last time we left one in the house for the sacrifice to fight back with, those creatures showed up in town. We lost 10 kids back then. Most were under a year old. I suddenly felt exhausted. It was as if I never slept in my entire life. It was clear this town had gone through more than I could ever imagine. Still, I wasn't certain I could forgive them for what they put me through. I placed a hand on my new little princess. She had gotten a few cuts, but nothing major. We drove in silence for a long while. Finally, he glanced over at us to comment on my new friend. I'm glad you had someone looking out for you. He nodded. I knew that if it was up to him, none of this would have happened. This town was under the thumb of pure evil, and they were managing the best they could. True to his word, he dropped me off at a motel. I spent the next 2 days there with Princess, unable to eat or sleep. I could sense she was worried about me. Before my body gave out, it was time to go home. I found some odd jobs here and there to support us. She still sleeps in my bed, but lately, she's been having issues walking. I know I won't have her forever. Having her next to me is the only way I'm able to sleep at night. No matter how much I try to forget, when the sun sets, I expect those things to come back to finish the job. If you're able to support a pet, I think everyone should get a friend like Princess. Life is easier when you have someone with sharp teeth at your side. Something grabbed my leg when I ran up the stairs. I can't be the only one. Ever since I was a kid, I would run up the basement stairs because I was scared someone was going to grab my leg. I would be in a full-on sprint all while trying to hit the light switch on my way up. There was always this constant feeling that something lurked behind me as I was coming back upstairs. In my childhood home, the game room was in the basement. You know what kind of basement I'm talking about. TV down there, Xbox, board games, computer, pool table. Maybe it was me being a dumb kid, but I continued to do it for years. It became a habit for me. Go downstairs, hang out, play games, watch TV. The end of the night would come and my Olympic training would start. Turn the TV off, swipe for the light as I sprint up the stairs, and then shut the door. Obviously, nothing ever grabbed me. It was just that fear of what was lurking in the dark behind me that gave me goosebumps. I would love to tell you as I got older I stopped doing it. But I didn't. I was a chicken and I'm not afraid to admit it. I slept with a night light until I was 13. I never left a closet door open when I went to sleep. And even as an adult, I always check the back seat of my car when I get in. My parents are retiring to Florida, and instead of selling the house right away, they decided to ask me if I had any interest in moving back in. The house is paid off, so I would just have to cover utilities. I got a pretty good job right out of college and can afford it, so I figure I would keep the memories alive and move in. The only downside to moving in is that I would be living alone. I did have family close by, which was a plus, but living by myself would be so strange. I lived with my parents until college, and during my college years, I always had a roommate, whether I lived in a dorm or an off-campus apartment. The night before my parents were moving out, we had a little going-away party for them. A ton of food and lots of drinks were had. My older sister lived a few blocks away, so the entire family was there. It was a fun yet emotional night. I know my parents weren't leaving forever, and I would still see them, but it still felt like a little piece of me was being taken on their retirement adventures. During the get-together, I pulled my mom to the side and asked if there was anything I should be concerned about when taking on the house. Any leaks, damage, problems, or creepy spirits I should be worried about. I may have presented that last part as a joke, but like I said, I was a chicken and was just slightly concerned about how I would handle living alone. My mom assured me that there were no problems with the house and that once I got used to normal house maintenance, it would be smooth sailing. Jason, you have to keep the house clean. You no longer have the luxury of an unpaid maid. We just remodeled the kitchen not too long ago, so all the appliances are new. My biggest worry with you is your laundry. Really, Mom, my laundry? Yes, Jason. You would always let all your dirty clothes build up, and when you would come visit, I would have to haul all your bags down to the basement and spend what felt like days washing and drying them. I thought you loved doing that, mater. That's why I would always save it for you, I said with a big grin on my face. My mom nudged me on the arm and walked away sighing and laughing. I hadn't even thought about that. Not only would I have to be in the house alone, not only would I have to laundry, but I would have to go to the basement alone. I leaned back against the wall and thought to myself, what the hell am I so worried about? I am a grown-ass man. This is the say-to-you-pay-ideas thing to be concerned about. A basement. That's my biggest concern, being scared of the dark as I run up the stairs. The thought alone made me laugh. It was ridiculous. I needed to grow up. The basement hadn't gotten much use as I got older. I started to go out more and hang with friends, and was barely even home. Then once I went to college, my visits home consisted of eating homemade food, seeing family, and going out drinking with friends. The pep talk to myself ended when I heard what sounded like a stampede coming up the basement steps. For a split second, I thought it was in my head until my nephew busted through the basement door. Breathing heavy and in near tears, he ran straight to his mother. Joey, are you okay? What happened? My sister asked. Still catching his breath, Joey answered. Mom, there is something downstairs. What are you talking about? Why were you in the basement? I interrupted. What did you see downstairs? I didn't see anything. I was coming up the stairs and someone tried to grab my leg. My sister's husband told his son to calm down and gave him a hug. He told him he would go in the basement and check. While everyone else in the house may think he was just a scared kid whose imagination got the best of him, for some reason I believed him. I can't tell you what it was, but I know he had the same feelings I had as a kid every time I came up those stairs. He felt like something was behind him. I would be lying if I told you I wasn't terrified. I never told anyone about the little routine I had when coming up the stairs from the basement, so nobody else seemed to be concerned. My sister was calming my nephew down as my brother-in-law made his way to the basement. I stood at the top of the stairs and looked down. I watched as he passed by the staircase several times, looking around for someone, something, anything. He found nothing. He made his way back upstairs, and he assured my nephew there was nothing down there and nothing to worry about. The night ended shortly after that. I said goodbye to my family and went over to hug my nephew. Uncle Jason. What's up, Paul? There is something down there. Be careful. He gave me a hug that lasted a bit longer than normal and headed toward the door. I was happy to have my parents stay at the house at least one more night before heading to Florida. After driving them to the airport, I returned back to the house. I walked in the front door and took a deep breath. This is it, I said to myself. I was on my own in the house now. I turned the lights on in the kitchen and living room, even though the sun was shining through the windows. It just gave me extra comfort knowing the lights were on. It was a safety blanket for me. I began to clean up from last night. Before I knew it, several hours had passed. I got a phone call from my sister. Jay, do you want to come over for dinner tonight? Sure, I don't have any plans. Sorry about Joey last night. He was still a little shaken up even when we got home. No need to apologize. I just feel bad he was so scared. He practically begged me to invite you over tonight, so I told him I would. I think he feels a little silly about what happened. I gotcha. No worries. 7 o'clock, good. Yeah, sounds like a plan. See you then. I rang the doorbell, and almost instantly the door swung open. It was Joey. He ran onto the porch and hugged me. Uncle Jason, you're okay? Yeah, buddy, I'm okay, are you? I said with a not-so-subtle fake laugh. My sister came to the door and grabbed my jacket. She hung it up and made her way towards the kitchen. Dinner will be ready in 5 minutes. Jack should be getting home from Jenny's soccer practice in a few. I took a seat at the dining room table, and I could feel Joey staring at me. Why was he so concerned? It struck me as odd, but it scared me more than anything else. What the hell did he see in that basement? What did he feel? Jack went to check. No one was down there. In all the years I lived at the house, there were no problems. Even though I ran up those stairs almost every night, nothing ever happened. I chalked it up to me just being a scared kid. Uncle Jason, did you go in the basement last night when I left? No, I did not. After seeing you run up those stairs, I wasn't risking it. I smiled at him nervously. Yeah, no, I'm not scared of anything. I was just seeing what old games you had down there. I had the light on. While I was sitting looking at the shelves, someone turned out the lights. I don't think anyone was close to the basement, buddy. I heard someone breathing. What? Someone was breathing down there with me. That's when I ran to the stairs. I felt something touch my leg when I opened the door. My sister walked into the dining room with a big tray of pasta. Food's ready. Jack walked in with Jenny and the kids went to go wash their hands. If no one could tell I was scared before, they could sure as shit see something was wrong now. My sister asked me what's wrong, and I told her I was just starving. I ate tons of food and tried to clear my mind of what Joey told me. I asked my sister if she had any wine. I purposely drank a bit too much, which caused my sister to tell me to just spend the night on the couch so I didn't drive home. I took her up on that offer and crashed on the couch. I didn't sleep much. It was Sunday now. I didn't want to be a burden to my sister and her family anymore, so I said goodbye and headed home. I had work tomorrow and had absolutely no clothes to wear. I had to do some laundry in that basement. I got home and gathered my clothes. I headed for the basement, making sure to hit every light switch on the way. I swung open the basement door and made sure to keep it open. I walked down the steps with my giant load of laundry and threw my clothes in the washing machine. I started it, and just as I went to turn around, I thought I heard a noise. Without hesitation, I headed for the stairs and sprinted up, skipping 4 steps with every lunge. I closed the basement door and realized that I left my phone on the table. That sound I heard was my phone vibrating. I gotta relax. When my clothes were finished washing, I put them in the dryer. When all was said and done with laundry, I brought it back upstairs without any incidents. For the next few weeks, I kept my visits to the basement at a minimum. I always had an uneasy feeling whenever I was down there. I always kept the lights on and never closed the door. Even though nothing had happened, I certainly wasn't going to take any chances. It had only been a short while my parents were in Florida, but they wanted to come back for the weekends so they could see the family. I, of course, told my parents that they could stay at the house. This was their house after all. We decided it would be a fun idea to have game night at the house. Game nights always consisted of good food, lots of laughs, and always, I mean always, arguments. What can I say? We were a competitive family. I grabbed my parents from the airport in the morning, and by dinner time, the rest of the family was over. Joey didn't leave his parents' side from the moment he got there. He was constantly looking around and listening intently to whatever sounds he heard. We played Uno, Sorry, and Trouble, all the classics. There was one big one we hadn't played yet, Monopoly, the ultimate argument maker. I teased my sister about how I used to destroy her in Monopoly, and how she still owes me money from the time she landed on Park Place and quit. After some laughing, I realized Monopoly wasn't upstairs. It was in the basement. Once I relayed the message to everyone that I had to go get it, Joey ran over to me and told me not to go. "Please, Uncle Jason, stay up here. We don't have to play Monopoly." "Relax, bud. It will take me 2 seconds. I'll be right back." "No," he shouted. "Please stay here." Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked over to us. Joey was clinging to me. My sister came over to put him at ease. I told him I wouldn't go down, and it was going to be all right. Without anyone noticing, my dad made his way toward the basement door. He just wanted everyone to keep having fun. He figured he could go down, grab the game, and come back up before anyone even realized. Well, we did realize. We realized because we heard the basement door slam, and my dad tumbled down the staircase. I sprinted over to the door and had to wrestle it open. It felt like someone was holding it from the other side. I finally threw it open and ran down the stairs. Monopoly money lined the basement floor. The game must have flew out of my dad's hand as he fell. He had a nasty bump on his head, but insisted he was okay. I asked him what happened, and he said he didn't know. I grabbed the game and was making my way back up the stairs. I just wanted everyone to keep having a good time. I got to the top of the stairs, and the door slammed shut. I lost my balance, and down I went. I'm fine, I swear. I helped my dad back up the stairs and sat him down at the table. My mother was worried and insisted he go to the hospital to get checked out. She didn't know if he was bleeding internally or maybe even suffered a concussion. I agreed with her and convinced my dad that he should go. As a family, we gathered our things and headed to the hospital. I figure I would need the next couple of days from work off to take care of my dad and make sure he was all right. It wasn't until we got to the hospital that I realized I left my phone back at home. I told my mom and sister that I needed to go home and grab it. Joey overheard and pleaded to go with me. I looked at my sister and she shrugged. "Please, Uncle Jason, I just want to make sure you are safe." When we walked in the door, something seemed off. I left the lights on when we left, but now they were off. I thought maybe the power went out, but when I hit the switch, the lights came back on. I thought maybe my mom hit them on the way out. I went to grab my phone from the counter when I noticed the basement door. It was closed. I know it was open when I left because once we got my dad back upstairs and we all agreed to go to the hospital, we left soon after, and no one went back towards the basement. Curiosity got the best of me. I opened the door. Just as quickly as I opened it, Joey pushed it shut. "Joey, why did you do that? I want to see something." There's nothing to see. You got your phone. Can we please leave? I looked at him for a brief moment and reached for the handle. I opened the door and saw the basement light was still on. I took a breath, closed my eyes for a split second, and made my way down. I don't know what I was looking for, but I was compelled to go down there. I heard Joey follow behind me down the stairs. I peered around the corner and saw nothing. Monopoly money still strewn across the floor, but nothing out of the ordinary. I hit the switch with the light still shining from the top of the stairs. See, nothing to worry about, I said as I turned around, proudly smiling, having conquered my fear. That's when I looked up and saw Joey standing by the door. He never came down. Whose footsteps? The door slammed shut and the lights went out. That's when I heard it. The breathing. I blindly ran up the stairs, hands stretched out in front of me, reaching for that door handle. I grabbed it and pushed but couldn't get through. Joey, why letting me out? Open the door. Open the folksy key door. I heard footsteps sprint up the stairs, and I felt someone wrap their hands around my leg. The door flew open, and I slammed it behind me. I heard clawing at the base of the door and leaned with all of my weight against it. I looked over to my right and saw Joey cowering in the corner with tears pouring down. Joey, were you holding the door? Through his screaming cries, he said, no. I told you something was down there. I grabbed Joey and we ran out of the house. When we got back to the hospital, I brought Joey to my sister and immediately called the police. They came by to investigate the empty house and found nothing in the basement. It wasn't until they came back up the stairs that they saw the claw marks on the door. Whatever was down there can stay. I'm not. That was my last night in that house. I don't think I'll ever go back. When I was 9, my grandfather's house was alive. When my grandfather got divorced, he didn't take it well. And after all the court proceedings were done and everything had been finalized, he just stayed alone in his house for months. I don't think being alone in a big house was good for him, though. I don't think it's good for anyone, really. I've always preferred smaller houses. The big ones felt like museums or hotels. They gave me the feeling that I really shouldn't stay too long. I guess Grandpa felt that too, because after a few months he moved to a double-wide flat on his property and stopped taking care of the big house. It stayed like that, just rotting and growing, for almost 20 years. When my dad started talking about going out to Grandpa's to clean up the big house, I, of course, wanted to go with him. Being a 9-year-old in northern Appalachia, I was always kind of outdoorsy, and Grandpa's house was in the middle of a beautiful forest that stretched for miles in every direction. At night, I would look up at the stars and make binoculars with my hands to try to see heaven. I never did, but that sky was pretty close. In hindsight, I don't really know why my dad let me come with him. It's not the best idea to bring a little kid into a 100-year-old collapsing house with hermit trash and 20 types of black mold. But despite that, I ended up right behind him as we walked in the front door. When the door opened, it let out this terrible rusty groan that reverberated through the house. It was so loud it shook my whole body. That held my attention for a little bit, but then I noticed the smell. It was a primordial funk that had fermented and distilled for 20 years until it became something closer to an emotion than a smell. At the time, I thought it smelled like tear gas, but I was 9, and I didn't know what tear gas smelled like, so I was probably wrong. The second thing I noticed was the unrealistic amount of trash. There were piles in every corner, covering every surface. Some piles towered over me, and I thought they might swallow me whole. Even at 9, I thought it was way too much for Grandpa to have accumulated in his months as a shut-in, but I chalked it up to him being a hoarder, and we started to go through the house room by room and get an idea of what we were dealing with. You know how sometimes if you're walking with another person and your footsteps are just out of sync enough, it can sound like there's a third person walking with you. I remember having that feeling multiple times as we walked from room to room, but I just brushed it off because it was a big house and we had a lot of ground to cover. When we finished our tour of the ground floor, We headed to the second floor. I remember my dad pausing for a little too long when he got upstairs. The only reason I remember that was because I got annoyed waiting behind him, and I was anxious to see more of the creepy old house. He muttered something under his breath, then walked in. The second floor was cleaner than the first, and it was much more open with the stairs leading into a large central living room and one hallway with 2 bedrooms on either side. But those didn't matter to me because in the corner of the living room there was a bed. Well, kind of a bed. It was 6 mismatched couch cushions arranged in a rectangle, and I remember it reminded me of something I'd make for a pillow fort, which I thought was awesome. But next to it was an old Coleman grill, a pot, a few cans of chili, and expired pet food. My dad said, "I thought no one lived here." And I remember thinking it was dumb because obviously no one lived here. Grandpa already said that. But either way, all of the stuff looked like it hadn't been used in a while, so I guess my dad assumed the owner of the pillow fort bed was gone. We finished checking out the second floor, and I was heading for the third when my dad sternly informed me it was a bad idea, as the floor had already collapsed in several places, and if I went up there, it was my fault if I died. I had been looking forward to the third floor and was disappointed that it would have to wait, but I did what I was told and went downstairs. The trash wasn't actually that bad downstairs, mostly just weeds and old food cans, but it still took us well into twilight before we only had some moldy furniture left and decided to start on the second floor. It was a lot darker up there, and I convinced my dad to let me use his super expensive flashlight. He'd gotten it from my mom on their anniversary, and we both thought it was the coolest thing ever. After about an hour of work upstairs, my dad told me he was tired and we should call it a night. But part of me still wanted to see that third floor. Something about it felt like it was calling to me. As my dad was leaving, I went over to the steps and looked up. You can imagine my confusion when I saw my dad standing on the top step. I went to go up after him, excited to see what was up there. And then I paused. He's too short, I thought. No, he was crouching. I couldn't see very well because of the darkness, but I could tell he was looking down at me. Then I heard the tearing bellow of the front door opening, and when I looked back up to my dad, I saw him slip back into the darkness. I was horrified. I turned and sprinted out of the house. I exploded through the front door down the porch steps, and I fell onto the damp evening grass. I heard my dad say something like, "Isaiah, are you okay? What happened?" And as the gears in my head began to spin again, I had a funny realization, and I started to laugh at my stupidity. No one lives in that house. Grandpa said so, and I had already assumed there would be some kind of animal living there, so it was either that or my imagination. I told my dad I just wanted to race back to the flat. Part 2. Flashlight, something closer to an emotion than a smell. At the time, I thought it smelled like tear gas, but I was 9, and I didn't know what tear gas smelled like, so I was probably wrong. The second thing I noticed was the unrealistic amount of trash. There were piles in every corner, covering every surface. Some piles towered over me, and I thought they might swallow me whole. Even at 9, I thought it was way too much for Grandpa to have accumulated in his months as a shut-in, but I chalked it up to him being a hoarder, and we started to go through the house room by room and get an idea of what we were dealing with. You know how sometimes, if you're walking with another person and your footsteps are just out of sync enough, it can sound like there's a third person walking with you. I remember having that feeling multiple times as we walked from room to room, but I just brushed it off because it was a big house and we had a lot of ground to cover. When we finished our tour of the ground floor, we headed to the second floor. I remember my dad pausing for a little too long when he got upstairs. The only reason I remember that was because I got annoyed waiting behind him, and I was anxious to see more of the creepy old house. He muttered something under his breath, then walked in. The second floor was cleaner than the first, and it was much more open with the stairs leading into a large central living room and one hallway with 2 bedrooms on either side. But those didn't matter to me because in the corner of the living room there was a bed. Well, kind of a bed. It was 6 mismatched couch cushions arranged in a rectangle, and I remember it reminded me of something I'd make for a pillow fort, which I thought was awesome. But next to it was an old Coleman grill, a pot, a few cans of chili, and expired pet food. My dad said, "I thought no one lived here." And I remember thinking it was dumb, because obviously no one lived here. Grandpa already said that. But either way, all of the stuff looked like it hadn't been used in a while. So I guess my dad assumed the owner of the pillow fort bed was gone. We finished checking out the second floor, and I was heading for the third when my dad sternly informed me it was a bad idea, as the floor had already collapsed in several places, and if I went up there, it was my fault if I died. I had been looking forward to the third floor and was disappointed that it would have to wait, but I did what I was told and went downstairs. The trash wasn't actually that bad downstairs, mostly just weeds and old food cans, but it still took us well into twilight before we only had some moldy furniture left and decided to start on the second floor. It was a lot darker up there, and I convinced my dad to let me use his super expensive flashlight. He'd gotten it from my mom on their anniversary, and we both thought it was the coolest thing ever. After about an hour of work upstairs, my dad told me he was tired and we should call it a night, but part of me still wanted to see that third floor. Something about it felt like it was calling to me. As my dad was leaving, I went over to the steps and looked up. You can imagine my confusion when I saw my dad standing on the top step. I went to go up after him, excited to see what was up there. And then I paused. He's too short, I thought. No, he was crouching. I couldn't see very well because of the darkness, but I could tell he was looking down at me. Then I heard the tearing bellow of the front door opening, and when I looked back up to my dad, I saw him slip back into the darkness. I was horrified. I turned and sprinted out of the house. I exploded through the front door down the porch steps, and I fell onto the damp evening grass. I heard my dad say something like, "Isaiah, are you okay? What happened?" And as the gears in my head began to spin again, I had a funny realization, and I started to laugh at my stupidity. No one lives in that house. Grandpa said so, and I had already assumed there would be some kind of animal living there, so it was either that or my imagination. I told my dad I just wanted to race back to the flat. Part 2. Flashlight. When we were walking back to the flat, I had the feeling that I had done something wrong, but I didn't know what it was. Then I realized, the flashlight. I had dropped it when I ran downstairs. It was still somewhere in that house, and if I lost it, my dad would kill me. When we walked inside and greeted my grandfather, I could feel a quiet terror squirming in my spine, and I knew I would have to go back in. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't get my mind off that house, and I was dreading having to explain myself. So I worked up the courage and convinced myself that I could go in and grab it before anyone would notice I was gone. And if I was going to go, it would have to be now. The sky was so beautiful at night it soothed my nerves like the sedatives they mix into a lethal injection. When I got to the front door, I was hardly afraid at all. The omnipresent roar of the front door announced my entry to the house, and I figured it was probably loud enough to send any animal into hiding. I could feel the house shifting in that silent night. I didn't realize it was so quiet until I started to hear my heartbeat in my ears. The first floor was just how we left it, just dirt and couches. So I went up to the second floor, confident it would be a short endeavor, still unshaken by the opaque darkness. I saw the flashlight immediately when I hit the last step. It was right there, waiting patiently for me next to the banister. I picked it up triumphantly. I didn't notice the heavy breathing. I was too excited to have my flashlight back. When I flicked on the light, I froze, fossilized in place by fear, my mind refusing to let me comprehend the danger I was in. Standing just a few feet in front of me was a man. He was tall and slouching. His ribs were showing through his ripped shirt like they were trying to claw through his pale kin. His ash-gray hair hung down past his knees in thin whispers. His brown teeth stood patiently in his hanging jaw. His hungry eyes, already consuming me, His throat cracked and popped as he spoke like it was the first time he had done it in years. He said, "Come over here." Those words, like cold water, snapped me out of my trance and forced my body to move. I ran as fast as I could out of the room, barely staying ahead of the roaring tarantula catching up to me. He sounded like he had too many legs. I could hear his skittering getting closer until I felt his damp breath on my neck. When I crossed the threshold of the front door, I felt my hair slit between the starved fingers on his hand. Some instinctual part of me said he was trying to pull me back into that silent night and devour me. I knew he wanted to pick my bones clean, and I knew if I stopped for even a second, he would have his wish. I didn't stop running until I got back to the flat, and for a while I could still hear him pacing and grunting outside like a rabid dog waiting for a baby bird to fall from a tree. I was so paralyzed I didn't even wake my dad. I just sat on the floor and waited till I heard the familiar downbow of the rusty hinges. My exhaustion overwhelmed me, and I let sleep claim my weary mind. In the morning, I woke abruptly to the sound of my dad getting up from the futon. I was still consumed with fear. I could barely tell my dad what I saw. All I told him was, "Last night I saw a man in the house." He was confused and tried to ask more questions, but I just sat there, consumed by my own thoughts, unable to look up from the floor, his voice drowned out by the memory of what the man had said. Eventually he gave up trying to question me, and just started hugging me and telling me I was Ak. He ended up talking to my grandpa about it, and they decided to check the trail cameras my grandfather had on the property. They were old, and it would sometimes take a while to record after the motion sensor would go off, so they weren't always reliable. But after they looked, my dad told me we had to go, and Grandpa would come stay with us for a while. In the back seat of the car on our way off the property, we passed the house. The front door was wide open, calling me to go back inside. My dad wouldn't tell me what he saw back then, but I'm 25 now, so I asked him about it. He told me he wished I had forgotten that, but nonetheless he told me. He was looking at you through the window all night. He didn't move an inch until sunrise. Being alone in a big house for a long time does something to a person. I'm glad I never stay long. Late night in the lab. I had a really awful experience in my lab recently. I've been pulling a lot of late nights in the lab. My PI and I are aiming to submit this paper in the next 2 months or so, and it's important that it gets done if I want to graduate by next semester. I'm so very close, but there is still so much to do. It doesn't help either that my lab mates and I have been constantly fighting each other for time on the microscope. The only time I can seem to find a long stretch free is after everyone goes home at night. I'm no stranger to working late. I like to work later in the evenings anyway, as I'm not really much of a morning person. I've had several late nights leaving here with the sun peeking out in the east. So with about a dozen freshly stained slides ready to go, the other night I booked the scope as soon as the day typically ends for my coworkers at 6 p.m. The sun is setting much earlier now that it's winter. I do like seeing the lights on the campus come to life from my lab window, with the trees decorated for the holiday season. It helps keep my spirits up to contrast the old and falling apart lab facility I spend all my time in. Our lab's microscope is a decade-old basic fluorescent scope kept in a repurposed utility closet in the hallway, far away from the windows. Being in there with the door closed and the lights off feels like being isolated in your own little world. The computer screen and the light going into samples creates the only illumination, aside from my phone. It has to be dark though, otherwise my slides will get overexposed. I settled in for a long night of imaging and set up my favorite true crime podcast to play like I usually do for long sessions. Once I get going, time moves surprisingly fast between finding cells to image and playing solitaire on my phone, while the microscope does its thing. So by the time I had to use the bathroom, it was already 11 p.m. Every time I step out of the little closet, my eyes always have to readjust. The hallway fluorescent lighting is not an easy transition. As I walked to the bathroom, I passed a few members of the custodial staff and smiled at them, saying hello. When I work nights, I'm always appreciative to see them, as otherwise this place feels really creepy. It's funny, I spend so much time here, but when you're alone and it's dark, the squeaking of old rotors and the rush of the ventilation system sound a bit more menacing. I went to the bathroom and then grabbed some snacks and water. Each slide takes around 2 hours, so I needed a few nights to get through this experiment. I tried to amp myself up to settle in again. I don't like being at lab past midnight. The cleaning staff are all finished by then, so I am really, truly alone. The lights in the building are all on automatic motion timers, so most of the hallway and lab lights go out after long enough. It makes me feel like a little kid, but I just get really freaked out by being so alone. I always try to rush quickly to make them turn back on again when I move about. If I could, I wouldn't leave my closet until 5 a.m. again, when the earliest risers come to check on their experiments. The closet doesn't lock, but it does make me feel better to be in my bubble. After my short break, I settled in to go back to my slides. I realized at this point I should probably switch to a different podcast. It's a mistake I've made before to listen to scary stories late at night. I started my next Z-Stack and worked my way through another 6 games of solitaire. It must have been another 2 hours. I'd switched to the next sample not too long before, when I heard what sounded like a knock on the closet door. I just about jumped out of my fucking skin. Who the hell is here so late? Hello? I called out. No response. Hello, is someone there? Nothing. I knew I should open the door to check, but God, I did not want to. It was dumb of me, but I kept imagining that someone was here to get me. Like the podcast had ramped up my paranoia. I argued with myself. There was no lock on the door. If a serial killer was really here to get me, they could just yank it open. That was such a silly thing to think. But also sometimes the building creaks, and from my headphones, I just think it's a knock. It was probably just that. So I didn't have to open the door, right? I turned back to my imaging and tried to settle my nerves back down. I continued on to the next field of cells. The images were taking way too long. I needed a wides, not to mention the weak signal meant every channel took way longer than I would have liked. I kept going. Before too long, I had to pee again. I looked at the clock. It was 1:30 a.m. I felt a knot in my stomach at the thought of walking all the way to the bathroom and back. But it couldn't wait. I finished the current stack and then opened the door wide. I liked to let the room air out when I could, not just because of my own smell, but because the room was connected by vents to the tissue fixation room, and the smell could get pretty strong seeping through even in the off hours. I hurried to the bathroom, walking way too fast. It would have looked odd if there were anyone around. I felt like a child running back to their room after turning the lights off downstairs so the monster wouldn't catch me. The lights in the hallway came on as I moved through them. I finished my business and repeated the same hurried journey back to my closet. With relief, I made it back to the door. Except, the door was closed. I had it wide. There's no draft in this building. How did it close on its own? I debated with myself again. What was scarier, standing in this empty hallway or opening the microscope room? It had to have closed on its own. Just because it never happened before doesn't mean it didn't happen now. I yanked the door open and then quickly shut behind me. The room was empty. Obviously it was. I sat down to find a new field for the next image, still breathing a little too fast. I'm an adult, for God's sake. Why was I so nervous about this? I turned on the blue channel, but I couldn't see the cell's nuclei anymore. The microscope was way off from the focus I had just left it. It was in a different place on the slide too. I couldn't take it anymore. I was so anxious I didn't think I could focus. Surely there was a good explanation for it, but I was not going to find it now. I took my slide off and powered down the scope and computer, wiped the oil off the lens. I needed to get some sleep. This was enough for the night. I put my slide into my box and propped open the door, this time with the trash can so it would air out. I then hurriedly started walking down the hallway to my lab. When I turned the corner and entered the corridor where my stuff was to get ready to leave, I stopped. I hadn't entered the lab space since my 11 p.m. break, but the lights were on. I looked around. Someone else had to be working here, right? But my lab was the only lab with lights on. I didn't see anyone around. Suddenly I heard a door slam shut loudly from the direction I had just come. I grabbed my stuff as quickly as I could and bolted towards the elevators. I pressed the buttons so aggressively before I realized I had to scan to call it. I swiped my badge. I was working myself into a panic. Then things started to get bright. The lights in the parallel hallway, by the elevators, began to turn on one by one, beginning at the opposite end of the hallway where I was. I swiped my badge again, and again, as if that would make the elevator come faster. The doors opened with a ding as I rushed inside, hitting the close door button and the first floor button over and over again. The final light before the light above the elevators came on just as the doors closed. I felt my breath catch up with me. I was breathing hard. When I got to the first floor, I rushed out of the building toward the parking lot. I practically ran to my car, frantically trying to reach for my keys in my bag. But they weren't there. I suddenly had a memory of placing them on my desk and not back in my bag, and realized I had left them behind. I wasn't going back up. Nothing was going to get me back up there until there were other staff here. Nothing. I would literally have to wait out in the freezing cold by my car for HOURs until the early morning cars started to arrive. But I just couldn't make myself go back to the lab, or even enter the building at all. When finally enough people had walked past my freezing ass to work, and the sun hinted itself in the sky, I went back inside. I took the elevator up, I scanned in, I grabbed my keys, and left without incident. Because of course I did. It's so silly, right? I risked freezing to death because I got a little spooked by some automatic lights and an old building. Right? I mean, I'm sure there is a good explanation for this. It should be fine for me to do another night, don't you think? I really have so much work I need to do. The power keeps going out in my office. I want to start by saying I hadn't worked in over 3 months. So when this place called me back, I was more than eager to dive right in. I would have taken any job, but this one seemed easy enough. I've had a lot of jobs over the years, something about adult ADHD, or whatever the doctor called it. This one isn't so bad, but recently, some pretty weird things have been happening. The job itself is easy. Facilities maintenance for an office supply company. I don't even really know what they do here. If I'm being honest, I'm not even sure the workers know either. They say they sell printers, paper and things, but I don't actually ever see that happening. They say they love their job. But weirdly enough, no one ever really talks to each other. So the place is often quiet and typically smells like stale coffee and whatever old air freshener they overuse in the lobby. It's a boring job. Well, the office is boring. My job is actually kind of interesting. This place was built in the 60s or 70s, I think, and so most of the systems are out of date and something always seems to be breaking. My boss, Earl, says he knows everything there is to know about this place and that most of it runs off hopes and a good prayer, which is good because I know nothing about maintenance. Earl is interesting. A 70-something grizzled old veteran with no sense of humor. At least not one I get. He's got a massive beer gut, smells faintly of liquor, and always has a half-smoked cigarette hanging from his lips, no matter how much the HR lady seems to bark at him for it. Normally, things around here aren't too hard to fix. Leaky faucets, buzzing lights, that one toilet that always clogs, things like that. But for the past few weeks, for reasons we don't know, the power has been going out. At first, it would just blink, a few flickers, and then we were back in business, but recently it's been getting worse. Last Friday, it went out for over 15 minutes. Every time it goes out, Earl tells me to just wait around, and that he'll be back. He apparently likes to tackle new projects by himself. Says it helps him really get the lay of the land. Whatever the hell that means. It's starting to become an odd routine. Power goes out, stay here. Earl goes into the basement. The power comes back on. It really doesn't bother me that Earl doesn't want my help. In fact, I typically just go into the break room and eat a snack or slink back to the maintenance office, which just happens to be a big closet full of random tools and other junk. Yesterday, the power went out for about 12 minutes, and when Earl returned, he had a nasty cut across the back of his hand and was consequently leaving a trail of blood wherever he walked. I grabbed him a kitchen towel from the break room and asked him if he was ok, to which he grumbled, "Ah, this is nothing." For what it's worth, I could have guessed he would say that. It may come as no surprise, but Earl is a man of few words. So few words, in fact, that even after 6 months, I still don't know much about the guy. I know that he's great at being grumpy in between telling me to hand him a vaguely described tool, and that he did his duty, which I'm assuming is war-related, but other than that, he's still a stranger. I was starting to get used to the routine when something weird happened. Earlier today, the lights started their now familiar song and dance. Then, as if on cue, cut out entirely. Earl looked up from his newspaper, got up, and headed for the basement. I asked him if he needed any help this time, but, as always, he had it under control. I was busy eyeing the useless vending machine's bountiful selection of old potato chips and peanut butter crackers when all at once, without warning, a piercing scream ripped through the stillness, coming from the basement. I jumped out of my skin and rushed to the basement stairs, only to see Earl wiping away sweat from his forehead with the same dirty rag he uses for everything. He was sporting yet another battle wound, except this one was across his face, and now that I think about it, it resembled a set of scratches, really. I asked him what the hell happened, and he shrugged it off. Something about the boilers overheating. Earl brushed past me and headed for the restroom. I asked him what we should do about the power, which seemed to remind him of our predicament. Before Earl had the chance to respond, the light came back on. Earl actually ended up leaving early today. He said he wasn't feeling too well and just wanted to lie down. In the time I've been here, Earl hasn't ever left early. Hell, he's never even taken a day off. But I figured Earl is pretty old, and this whole power issue has seemed to be kicking his ass. The last few hours of the day went fine. I was in the middle of making a paperclip chain when Earl actually ended up leaving early today. He said he wasn't feeling too well and just wanted to lie down. In the time I've been here, Earl hasn't ever left early. Hell, he's never even taken a day off. But I figured Earl is pretty old, and this whole power issue has seemed to be kicking his ass. The last few hours of the day went fine. I was in the middle of making a paperclip chain when I stopped to think. Why did Earl have those scratches on his face? Why did they look like scratches? And what the hell was that awful scream? I didn't even know the building had a boiler system. What even is a boiler system? I had too many questions, so I decided to just go check it out myself. Surprisingly, Earl had locked the basement, and none of the keys I had seemed to fit the lock. I went to ask the HR lady, Brenda, if she happened to have an extra key, but she seemed too scatterbrained to understand what I was asking, and so I left and went back to the closet. I've decided to keep a record of everything weird that's been happening. I'm writing this from a dusty old desktop that has been in the corner of this closet since who knows when. I was surprised it even turned on. Tomorrow I'm going to ask Earl if we can both take a look at the electrical system. I'm dying to figure out what's going on, and maybe understand why Earl has been acting so weird. I'll update this record as soon as I know more. Bye for now.